Air power ended the Pacific War in a way beyond the imagination of any of the visionary pre-war strategists. None of the Japanese or American planning have been conducted with any idea of the two weapons which would bring the war so completely and so suddenly to an end: the Boeing Superfortress and the atomic bomb. Conventional air power had gone a long way toward defeating the Japanese, but they were determined to resist an invasion with every weapon at their disposal. The Japanese were a homogeneous nation, 100 million strong. They were willing to die for their country and for their emperor. The Boeing B-29 was the most expensive single project of World War II. It cost more than $3 billion for design, development, production, and deployment. The Manhattan Project, which resulted in the atomic bomb, cost $2 billion. The B-29 was clearly the most outstanding bomber in the war by any standards of performance. It was far ahead of the American B-17 and the British Lancaster. The Superfortress was the joint project of a few visionary American corps planners. They were aided by General Hap Arnold, who pushed the program through the spite of many hazards. The other important factor was the engineering strength and heavy bomber experience of the Boeing Aircraft Corporation. By 1940, it seemed possible that England would be invaded and occupied. That meant that Nazi Germany would have to be bombed by US bases. The Air Corps called for a speed of 400 miles an hour, a range of 5,333 miles, and a 2,000-pound bomb load. It was an audacious gamble of the part of the Air Corps and of the Boeing Company. Boeing was perhaps taking the greater chance. The Air Corps could hedge its bets with other manufacturers for less ambitious airplanes. But Boeing had to rely not only on its own capability, it also had to trust its vendors. Many of them were being asked to create components fully as advanced as the aircraft itself. Shortcuts had to be taken. Each one added to an already ambitious program. Dollars were freely available, but they were not always a solution. The handsome, streamlined airframe was a radical departure from all previous Boeing practice. It involved new metals and new fabrication techniques. Boeing's entire production capacity was occupied with building the B-17. For the B-29, it was necessary to build entire new plants, and there was a greater challenge: the creation of a new, highly skilled workforce. Vast schools were established on the factory sites, with 90 days of training or less. Farmers, housewives, and young people just out of high school were taught how to do everything necessary to build the most complex aircraft in history. By 1943, Boeing had 58,000 employees building the B-29. Boeing knew from the start that its greatest question mark was the unproven engine. The R-3350 needed several years more development than was available. It would go into the field unready. It would be a constant nightmare to mechanics and a worry to pilots taking off with too heavy loads from too short runways. Even with the R-3350's power, the speed and range requirements were too difficult to attain. They could only be achieved by combining a highly streamlined design with a wing using a new Boeing high-lift airfoil and sophisticated flap system. The USAAF thought Boeing's approach was too radical. They thought the wing loading was too high and that its pilots wouldn't be able to handle the airplane. They cited the experience of the notorious Martin B-26 as an example. Boeing analyzed the B-26 and found that it had a low aspect ratio wing mounted on the fuselage in a way that induced drag. They explained that the B-26 problem stemmed out from bad design. They said that the B-29's excellent design would avoid difficulties. To achieve the necessary performance, the B-29 had to operate at high altitudes. For this, pressurization of the fuselage was mandatory. Boeing had experimented with pressurization in the Model 307 Stratoliner passenger plane, but no production bomber had ever been pressurized. The B-29 adopted a new three-bubble system. The pilot, co-pilot, engineer, radio operator, and navigator were up in the front pod. The gunners were positioned in the mid-fuselage pressurized area and connected to the cockpit by a tunnel spanning the twin bomb bays. The tail gunner was crammed into a third pressurized compartment in the rear, isolated and very much alone. Because of the pressurization system, standard gun turrets could not be used. The armament had to be remotely operated. A General Electric fire control system had to be created. It used an early computer that compensated for speed, range, altitude, wind temperature, and trajectory. The results were remarkably good. Any gunner apart from the tail gunner could control more than one station. The computers permitted firing at targets beyond the range of conventional hand-operated guns. The demand for the Boeing B-29 increased. Rival firms Bell Aircraft and Glenn Martin were tasked to build it. Boeing felt it was being asked to train competition for the post-war marketplace. By the time the XB-29 made its first flight on September 21, 1942, the USAAF had placed a mammoth order for 1,664 of the aircraft. But the first two prototypes caught fire in the air. The second one crashed into a meat packing plant. The entire crew was killed. In spite of all the difficulties, the first B-29 of the 58th Bombardment Wing landed at Kharagpur, India on April 24, 1944 to begin Operation Matterhorn. Operation Matterhorn was designed to knock out the Japanese steel industry. The idea of B-29 bombing Japan from Chinese bases was attractive in political terms. President Roosevelt had promised Chiang Kai-shek to begin bombing operations against Japan by November 1944. But in practice, it was flawed for a wide variety of economic, logistic, and command reasons. Chiang Kai-shek's subordinates refused to get serious about building air bases until enough money had been paid to permit embezzlement on a massive scale. Army General Vinegar Joe Stilwell estimated that at least half of the $100 million in gold required by the Chinese was siphoned off to corrupt officials. The air bases themselves were a monument to the patience and industry of the Chinese people. They literally built them by hand, without power equipment of any sort. They used the most primitive tools to move earth or chip stones. The operation was based on the assumption that the B-29s would support their own operations by flying gasoline over the hump, the high mountain passes in the Himalayas separating India and China. The B-29s would be supported by a fleet of B-24s serving as tankers. But the B-29 was a brand new weapon that had not yet received sufficient testing. It would be bad practice to subject it to continuous flights over the mountains. Then, there was the primitive maintenance and the continuing shortage of parts and labor. But the task had to be done. There was no alternative. The complexity of the logistics was a function of the sheer size of the B-29 units. The Superfortress had a crew of 7. 7 aircraft were assigned per squadron, and there were 28 per group, and a grand total of 112 for the wing. Each B-29 was assigned 2 crews. A fully manned wing had a total personnel of 11,112. When all its elements arrived overseas, 20th Bomber Command had more than 20,000 officers and men plucked down in brand new bases in India and China, eager to go to war. Lieutenant General George Stratomayor was made responsible for the 20th Bomber Command's administration and logistics. General Claire Chennault was responsible for the fighter defense and complete ground support of the B-29 bases in China. The B-29's very first combat raid was mounted on June 5, 1944. General Wolfe led 98 aircraft against the railroad marshalling yards in Bangkok, Thailand. Five aircraft crashed en route, 42 had to make emergency landings. Later reconnaissance revealed that fewer than 20 bombs had landed in the target area. It was not a good start for the $3 billion program. The commanders were veterans on the European theater. They were not yet aware of how different the B-29 was from the B-17. Nor were they aware of how difficult the Japanese targets, geography, and weather were compared to Germany's. Hap Arnold demanded better results. He wanted an attack on the Japanese homeland. On June 15th, Wolfe launched 92 B-29s from India. Of these, only 79 reached their Chinese staging bases. 78 were dispatched on a night raid against the steel mills of Yawata and Kyushu, Japan. Each plane carried 2 tons of bombs. The results were once again disappointing. Only 47 aircraft made it to Yawata. Only one bomb hit Yawata. It damaged a power station more than half a mile from the steel mill coke ovens. The Americans took comfort in the damage they must have caused to Japanese morale, but Arnold was not after Japanese morale. He was after their industry. The story of the next 6 months was much the same. And at home in the US, there was a myriad of B-29 production problems. Wolfe was sent back to sort them out. In September, the 20th Bomber Command was taken over by a firebrand from Europe. His name was Curtis LeMay. The dramatic acceleration of the Pacific War permitted a two-pronged strategy of attack. From bases in Chengsu, China, the 1,600-mile operating radius of the B-29 permitted it to hit targets from Manchuria through Japan all the way down to the tip of French Indochina. Superfortresses operating from Saipan and the Marianas could cover all the important targets in the heartland of Japan. Curtis LeMay's 20th Bomber Command was the first of 2 proms. To provide the second, the 21st Bomber Command was established in November 1944. It was to operate out of new airfields in the Marianas Islands. One of the United States Army Air Force's great planners, Possum Hansel, was made commanding officer of the 21st. Hansel landed his B-29 Jolt and Josie, the Pacific Pioneer, on Saipan on October 12, 1944. He was eager to validate in battle the many plans he participated in creating.
The first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fights, we'll do some more talk. Thanks.
Hansel felt the weight of his responsibility. He knew that even Curtis LeMay, in spite of his success in Europe, was having trouble turning things around against the Japanese and China. LeMay's problems with the 20th Command included difficulty of supply and the unreliability of the B-29's R-3350 engines. Occasionally, good bombing results were obtained. In April 1945, the assets of the 20th Bomber Command would be transferred to Tinian and Guam. By then, it had failed in its essential task of sustained bombing of Japan. So much had been expected of the B-29 that the American commanders were driven to prove that it was in fact an excellent weapon. At the very highest levels of command, where people were aware of the Manhattan Project, the urgency was even greater. Only the B-29 could carry the atomic bomb. If the Superfortress failed, the Manhattan Project became a complete waste. The pressure was felt and transmitted. But in the months after his arrival on Saipan with the 21st, Hansel was able to do no better than had previously been done in the 20th from China. The Committee of Operational Analysis had reconsidered the priorities in Japan. They now suggested that the aviation industry was the most important target. This had been the Air Force's choice all along. The Joint Chiefs of Staff directed that the principal aircraft engine manufacturers around Tokyo became the primary targets. The long series of attacks on Tokyo would be helped by the incredible bravery and skill of the crew of an F-13. The F-13 was the unarmed reconnaissance version of the Superfortress. Early in the morning of November 1st, 1944, Captain Ralph D. Stakely's F-13 became the first U.S. plane to fly over Tokyo since the Doolittle raid. These photos became the basis for all U.S. attacks on the city. Hansel's first strike on Tokyo was to be called San Antonio 1. After much training and many postponements, San Antonio 1 began at 6:15 a.m. on November 24th. The first plane to roll down Isley Field's runway was Dauntless Dottie, flown by Brigadier General Rosie O'Donnell. His co-pilot, Major Robert K. Morgan, had been a pilot on the famous B-17 Memphis Belle. Dauntless Dottie was followed by 110 more B-29s, carrying 278 tons of bombs. But the promising start to the mission unraveled. 17 aircraft aborted. Six more found themselves unable to bomb for mechanical reasons. The rest were caught up in a 120-knot wind. It was the infamous jet stream, then only just being recognized. They were swept over the target at a blistering 445 miles an hour. It was too fast for accurate bombing. But on the positive side, Japanese fighters' resistance was light. Flak was ineffective. Once again, reconnaissance photos showed the bombing results to be totally inadequate. Only 16 bombs had been observed to hit the target area. By now, the B-29 was performing fairly well. Extensive modifications had improved the reliability of its engines. But bombs were still not hitting the targets. The early Japanese analysis was that the costs of the B-29 were so great and its results so negligible that not even a wealthy nation like the United States could afford to persist the attacks. But unknown to all of the Japanese and most of the Americans, a change was in the wind. On December 18, 1944, 84 B-29s of Curtis LeMay's 20th Bomber Command dropped 500 incendiary bombs in a daylight raid on Hankow, China. The attack destroyed the city as a major Japanese base. As a result of the success of LeMay's incendiary raid, Hansel's 21st Bomber Command was ordered to take a test raid on the city of Nagoya in Japan. It would be made by at least 100 B-29s, all dropping incendiary bombs. Hansel objected, saying that he wanted to continue precision bombing of the Japanese aircraft industry. In doing so, he put his career on the skids. You can buck the brass in the military, but only if you succeed. A test raid was run on Nagoya on January 3, 1945. 97 B-29s carried mostly incendiary bombs. It was not a good mission. Only 57 aircraft bombed the designated target. Damage on the ground was slight. The Japanese drew the conclusion that their fire prevention system was highly efficient. It was an erroneous and eventually disastrous assumption. Hansel reverted to his previous precision bombing tactics. He was unable to generate better results, apart from the one successful attack on the Kawasaki aircraft plant near Kobe. The one success didn't help Hansel. If you worked for Hab Arnold, you delivered or you were relieved. Hansel was relieved by Major General Curtis LeMay. Hansel's forte was planning. The time for planning was past. Now was the time for direct action, which was Curtis LeMay's strength. As a new commander, LeMay received more latitude than Hansel. He made 2 attacks using Hansel's method. Then he put 69 aircraft over Kobe to drop incendiary bombs. There was heavy fighter opposition. 2 B-29s were lost and 35 badly damaged. But the city of Kobe was hurt. More than 1,000 buildings were destroyed. In the latter part of the war, America's overwhelming advantage in numbers and quality usually allowed American forces to brush Japanese opposition aside. As the precision bombing efforts continued, further tests were made with incendiary bombs. In a heavy attack on Tokyo on February 25th, almost 30,000 buildings were destroyed, but the precision strikes against Japan continued to be ineffective. Enemy fighter opposition stiffened. In the series of attacks in February, 29 B-29s were lost to fighters, 10 were lost to flak. Almost as many were lost on the long overwater trip between Saipan and Japan. Another 21 crashed because of operational problems like engine fires, runaway propellers, or fuel exhaustion. And so far, the results were insignificant. The B-29, the multi-billion-dollar bomber, had failed in its intended role. But Curtis LeMay already had the remedy in mind. LeMay was aware that he was as vulnerable to have Arnold's impatience as any other man. He decided to try tactics he'd long considered and which had been carefully tested in the United States. It was the common opinion that Japanese cities were much more vulnerable to firebombing than those of Germany. And although Japanese industry was spread out into residential areas, it was still far more concentrated than its German counterpart. The B-29 had been designed from the start as a high-altitude bomber. In the European theater, it would have had to remain so. But conditions were different in Japan. Anti-aircraft guns and searchlights were not radar-controlled. It was reported that there were only 2 night fighter units in the homeland. Japanese airborne radar was primitive and not widely used. Without notifying General Arnold, LeMay decided to launch a series of maximum-effort, low-level incendiary night attacks against Japan. He was putting his career on the line. Night bombing offered many advantages. The winds were not so strong. The B-29's navigation system operated more efficiently, flying at lower altitude, easing the strain on the engines, lowering the fuel consumption, and leaving behind armament and ammunition permitted as a much bigger bomb load. About 12,000 pounds per plane. The concept of unarmed, low-level night bombing alarmed many of LeMay's staff. The word murder was quietly mentioned, but never to LeMay. The first raid was set for the night of March 9th. 334 B-29s carried almost 2,000 tons of bombs. The aircraft and the lead squadrons were to act as simple pathfinders. Their napalm bombs were intended to start major appliance fires, which would require the mobilization of all the Japanese firefighting equipment. The rest of the B-29s each carried 24 cluster units of M69 incendiary bombs. The M69 was designed by a high-level group of American scientists and engineers, some of whom were also involved in the Manhattan Project. Each M69 was only 20 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. It weighed just over 6 pounds. On crashing through the roof of its target, it was designed to detonate and spew out flaming gel as far as 30 yards. The gel stuck to whatever it hit, and it burned with hellish intensity. The technology of the M69 and the great logistics and support effort needed to deliver its target was an expression of the disparity between the American and Japanese war machines in 1945. The Japanese simply had no counter and no equivalent. On the evening of March 9th, it took almost 3 hours for LeMay's entire forces of B-29s to get airborne. The bombers would approach Tokyo individually at altitudes from 4,900 to 9,200 feet. Over Tokyo, the visibility was 10 miles or better. The napalm bombs of the Pathfinder aircraft started fires that were fanned by a brisk and rising wind. The initial attack hit a 12-mile square of the most densely populated part of the city. The fire spread rapidly and the results were devastating. The fire services were overwhelmed within 30 minutes of the attack. A firestorm swept the city. More than 1/4 of a million buildings were destroyed. More than 1/4 of the city's houses were gone. More than 1 million people were homeless. 83,000 dead. 160,000 injured. The Japanese were horror-stricken. There was no way to comprehend the disaster of this magnitude. It completely overrode the ideas of national superiority and the samurai spirit, and of the nation's place in the sun. On March 11th, the city of Nagoya became a target for incendiary attack. There was no firestorm, but 2 square miles of the city were destroyed. Osaka was attacked on March 13th. The city was blanketed by cloud cover and the B-29s were forced to use radar bombing. Unexpectedly, that gave more uniform results than visual bombing. Within 3 hours, more than 8 square miles of the city were totally destroyed. Morale in the B-29 units kept climbing. LeMay had found the magic formula. He made maximum use of the B-29 in tactics that took advantage of the enemy's weakness. These tactics converted the B-29 from a blunder to a war winner. LeMay was on a rampage. He drove his crews hard. They were already flying 60 hours a month. That was higher than the average of the 8th Air Force in Europe. But there was a shortage of replacements, and that shortage forced LeMay to increase monthly combat time to 80 hours. He had the scent of victory in his nostrils, victory over Japan, and victory over the concept of air power. LeMay knew that he had arrived at a point that General Coral Spots and Bomber Harris had only dreamed of. He had the ultimate weapon at his disposal, and he knew that there was more to come. He believed that the maximum effort with his command could destroy Japan's ability to wage war. The strength of the 21st Bomber Command grew every day. By April, LeMay had more than 500 aircraft at his disposal. On May 11th, he launched a further attack on the 3 Japanese cities. His goal was to create such havoc that the terrible cost America had borne invading Okinawa would not be repeated in Japan. By June 15th, he had destroyed 112 square miles of Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama, and Kawasaki. His B-29s had now the benefit of long-range escort fighters, P-51s from Iwo Jima. LeMay had destroyed the 6 principal industry cities of Japan at a cost of 136 aircraft. The American loss rate, 1.9%, was acceptable, but the reality of it was still horrific. Japan was not able to stop this destruction. It lacked anti-aircraft guns, radar, and fighters to repel the invaders. It lacked fire engines, bomb shelters, and hospitals to help its citizens. Yet Japan was held captive by a martial spirit. That spirit had served the country ill on almost every battlefield in this war, but the government voted to fight on. LeMay and the 21st Bomber Command had brought Japan to its knees, but it would not surrender. The B-29's success in area bombing was a great relief to all those who had staked so much on its development. At the time, few people were aware of the Manhattan Project, and the essential role of the B-29 would have been in the successful delivery of an atomic weapon. By July 1941, a decision had been made to create an atomic bomb before the Germans did. The Manhattan Project eventually employed 120,000 people, including the country's top engineers and scientists. On July 16, 1945, an experimental bomb was detonated with results that were incredible even to those who had created it. Word of the successful test was immediately sent to the new president, Harry S. Truman. Truman, who was a novice, was plunged into the Potsdam Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Truman mentioned to Stalin that a powerful new weapon had been tested. Stalin responded that he hoped it would be tested to good effect against the Japanese. Truman was pleased that Stalin did not press for more information. He was unaware that Stalin already knew what he needed to know from the Soviet spies at the center of the Manhattan Project. The Potsdam Declaration of July 26 indirectly warned the Japanese of the power of a new weapon. It stated that the only alternative to surrender was prompt and utter destruction. Japan was badly wounded by the B-29 raids. It was also cut off from food and industrial imports. Japanese leaders were fully aware that the war was lost, but as yet had not found a way to acknowledge it. A cultural phenomenon emerged unfamiliar to the West. It was mokusazu, a time-honored technique by which a Japanese officer would take refuge in a lofty silence when he did not agree with or did not understand an order. When the new Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki announced his response to the Potsdam Declaration, he used the term makatsu. He meant to say, in essence, no comment. But his remarks were translated as meaning that Japan was contemptuously ignoring the declaration. It was a fatal error. In early 1944, plans for modifying 15 B-29s were formulated. The modifications were not extensive. The atomic bombs were being designed at the same time. The designs were adapted as much as possible to fit the B-29's bomb bay. The following summer, Arnold authorized the top-secret team of experts to create the first combat unit to use the new weapon. Colonel Paul W. Tibbits, Jr. was elected as commander of the new 509th Composite Group. The remainder of the group was handpicked to get the best possible people. For a long time, Tibbits was the only person in the 509th to know the true nature of the mission. The special facilities required for handling and loading the bomb were prepared in Tinian in the spring of 1945. By July, the 509th and its specially modified B-29s were in place. Further training began immediately with 6 specialized missions. Some of them involved harassment bombing of isolated garrisons on the islands of Truk and Marcus. After July 20th, the 509th crews executed 38 sorties, gaining experience in the precise tactics to be used when the atomic bomb was dropped. These sorties also made the sight of small formations of B-29 seem customary to the Japanese. A list of target cities was drawn up. They were the largest cities with the least damage remaining in Japan. Kyoto was removed because of its cultural significance and because of the negative reaction in Europe to the bombing of Dresden. Truman and Secretary Stimson felt the destruction of Kyoto might drive Japan into the Russian camp after the war. Hiroshima was now at the head of the line. Later, Nagasaki was added to the list. On Tinian, all necessary elements of the strike were prepared. Field Order No. 13 was signed on August 2, 1945 by Lieutenant General Nathan Twining. It directed the 509th Group to make a visual attack on Hiroshima. At one time, Hiroshima had been a busy naval port, but the port had been mined and the population was now reduced to under 250,000 people. There were many military installations. The entire economy was geared to the Japanese war effort. There were no Allied prisoner of war camps in the area. Seven aircraft were assigned to the mission. Leading the principal force was Tibbits and Enola Gay, named after his mother. Enola Gay was accompanied by 2 escort planes, crammed with cameras and observers to record the event. 3 aircraft were assigned duty as weather planes, 1 was designated a spare. On August 4th, the crews were told that the exact nature of the mission, and one of the bombs predicted 20,000 tons of TNT power, but even then they were not told it was an atomic bomb. At 2:45 in the morning of August 6th, the Enola Gay took off. Five and a half hours later, Tibbits received word that the weather and visibility were good. At exactly 9:15, Enola Gay was flying at 328 miles an hour at 31,600 feet. Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee dropped the bomb. Tibbits then executed what later became known as the breakaway maneuver, a steeply banked 150-degree turn to avoid the expected blast by the time the bomb exploded 50 seconds later. The Enola Gay was 19 miles away. At detonation, there occurred the fireball, followed by the swiftly rising mass of smoke that turned into the notorious mushroom cloud. The cloud that still casts its symbolic shadow. President Truman immediately announced the event to the world. The news amazed many members of the 509th Composite Group. The Japanese reaction was confused. Officially, they diminished the results of the attack. They said that it was only a new bomb which should not be made light of. Certainly not. 4.7 square miles of Hiroshima center had been obliterated. More than 40,000 buildings were destroyed. Almost 80,000 people were killed. 171,000 were made homeless. LeMay's B-29s and the U.S. Navy's carrier forces maintained pressure against Japan while the sole remaining atomic weapon in the world was prepared for use. The second and last atomic mission of the war began at 3:49 on August 9th. Major Sweeney and his crew flew boxcar. They traded their aircraft, the Great Artise, to Captain Frederick C. Bach. Sweeney's mission was as troublesome as Tibbits' mission had been trouble-free. The primary target was Kokura, but it was weathered in. Sweeney made 3 bomb runs. The bombardier couldn't see the target visually. Some Japanese fighters were in the area. Sweeney diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki, which was also cloud-covered. Boxcar used radio for its run-in at the last minute. The bombardier, Captain Kermit Behan, saw the target at 10:58. He hit the bomb release. Most people were either at work or at home when the bomb detonated within 1 mile of the 2 huge Mitsubishi arms factories. Nagasaki's bowl-shaped terrain confined the effects of the bomb to a relatively small 1.45 square mile area. Approximately 35,000 people were killed. Incredibly, Emperor Hirohito's advisors on the Supreme Council for the direction of the war still debated whether or not to surrender. As Adolf Hitler had done, the military factions still wanted to resist in hope of obtaining better terms. On August 19th, the Japanese announced not their surrender, but their willingness to accept the Potsdam Declaration. In the days preceding the Japanese statement, routine B-29 missions had continued. On August 11th, they were suspended to give the negotiations a chance to mature. The United States responded to the August 10th Japanese statement by advising that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government were subject to the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. When no word came back from the Japanese government, LeMay's B-29s were authorized to resume attacks. General Arnold had long waited his own Tokyo Millennium, 1,000 aircraft over Tokyo, while General Spaatz would have preferred to use such third atomic bomb if one had been available. LeMay was able to meet Arnold's wish. He put up a total of 828 bombers and 186 fighters over 1,000 aircraft all over Tokyo on August 14th. Before the last aircraft had landed, Japan had surrendered. The American forces continued to make a display of their air power over Japan. This reached the highlight September 2nd. 462 B-29s cruised over Tokyo Bay. All the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri. In the meantime, 900 B-29s had dropped almost 5,000 tons of supplies to more than 63,000 prisoners of war. Not only that, but camps in Japan, China, and Korea.
Air Force General Henry Harley Arnold, writes in 1941, "A nation likely and able to win a war will enter it not only with the largest and most efficient air force, but behind that first line will stand the second line, the ability to maintain that superior strength in men and machines." 3 years later, the general's prophecy is now reality. On June 15, 1944, the first B-29s fly over mainland Japan. Unlike the Doolittle raid 2 years prior, this is a mission of epic proportions. That is because Boeing's Superfortress, the largest plane in the world, is designed for destruction, to grind the Japanese into a pulp, to bring them down to their knees once and for all. With wings spreading over 140 feet, a fuselage 98 feet long, and 4 engines each possessing 2,200 horsepower, the Superfortress is the envy of the entire world, a true symbol of American industrial power. Billions of dollars, combined with the blood, sweat, and tears of its creators, make this the most feared aircraft of the Second World War. For it is a weapon that doesn't start wars, it finishes them. For all its accolades and accomplishments, the Superfortress is America's biggest gamble of the war. A design so complicated, it is the most expensive risk for the United States government. A project that at times seems doomed for failure, and a project that requires a contingency plan. What to do if it never makes it out of the factories? Where to go if the people of Boeing cannot get the job done? This is the secret history behind one of aviation's greatest bombers, and how it almost never came to be. The what-if scenarios that America is prepared to take in order to get it off the ground and win the war raging in the Pacific. This is the race for the Superfortress. Even before America is officially involved in the Second World War, the B-29 is already envisioned. The need for long-range aircraft capable of rendering a decisive blow against any potential enemy is an urgent priority for visionary generals like Hap Arnold. For the next 2.5 years, as America remains officially neutral, they are behind the scenes, making extensive plans that include a barrage of new military projects, with a long-range bomber high on the list. Not until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 do the wheels begin to seriously move.
In the first few weeks of war, over 350 of the 525 combat planes we had in the Pacific area were destroyed. Over 1/4 of our total combat strength was lost. We suddenly found ourselves engaged in a mortal struggle with an enemy who could be counted on for nothing except bitter and fanatic opposition.
According to President Roosevelt, the United States was not particularly well prepared to engage in the war itself. In 1940, Roosevelt called for increased congressional appropriations for military spending, arguing that what the United States needed was to be producing 50,000 planes per year. In 1939, the U.S. produced fewer than 6,000 planes.
With the United States at war against both Japan and Germany, bombers are rushed into service. As one old soldier remarked, "Isn't it sad? During all the years since the First World War, we've had all the time in the world, but no money. Now we have all the money in the world, but no time." In this race against the clock, America comes together. Bombers are wheeled out of assembly lines in order to wreak havoc over Germany. Of notable distinction are Boeing's Flying Fortress and Consolidated's Liberator, where in Europe, with Britain providing a base for operations, American air power is successful due to the short distance from England to Germany. On the other side of the world, the situation is very different. In the Pacific, aircraft with a greater range are needed in order to attack the heart of Japan. It is this geographical requirement that calls for the construction of a design that not only delivers tremendous firepower, but ensures that it reaches its target there and back safely. Operation Matterhorn, the secret plan to bomb the Japanese from China. Approved by President Roosevelt, it is in these pages that the urgent need for the Superfortress is born.
The initial requirements, simply as I recall them, were a 5,333 mile range, and I don't know why that odd number, a 2,000 pound bomb load, and I think the speed that they specified was something like 273 miles an hour or something. Those were the basic requirements.
A unique organization, the 20th Air Force, is formed, headed personally by Hap Arnold, to see over all B-29 operations. All the military needs now is for one company to step up. Unlike the military-industrial complex of today, during the 1930s, aviation companies are hesitant to get in bed with the government to make military planes.
Companies that could easily be producing military goods, such as aircraft factories, were reluctant to convert their plants for military production because they weren't sure how long hostilities would last.
In an era of neutrality acts and cynicism towards any signs of war profiteering, only fixed price contracts are given by the United States. Under these rules, the developer must put forth their own money towards the design with no guarantee of a deal being signed. And with technology becoming more complex, signing on to the B-29 is like playing Russian roulette with your company's future. It is a large risk, one that the giants of aviation are not willing to take. As one Boeing employee said, "There was no sound of coin in Uncle Sam's jeans. His pockets only carried marbles and chalk." With most manufacturers losing money during this period, few were willing to step up to the plate.
The military production in which U.S. workers were engaged in 1940 and 41 as part of the effort to support the Allied forces helped to pull the United States out of the Depression. Lots of people were back to work, and what that meant was that they had disposable income. Many manufacturing firms did not want to convert to military production because they were eager to take advantage of that consumer dollar that was now available.
Douglas, a rare company to turn a profit during the Great Depression, is avoiding the super bomber project like the plague. After having their arms bent by the government to develop the B-19, they reported losses of more than $2 million. Not wanting to be fooled again, their submission for the contract is nothing more than a slightly modified version of that same bomber. In government circles, there is great concern. If Douglas is only putting forth a minimal effort, it is apparent that they are not interested. Lockheed, another manufacturer, is still a young company and a question mark at best. Boeing, having lost money on the B-17, would have gone bankrupt had the government not bailed them out in 1940. With only 2,000 employees, they, like others, want to stick with what is known and proven, instead of venturing out into the uncertain. Surprisingly, they submit their design, and it is accepted.
Boeing had a tremendous reputation on the basis of the B-17. And when you think about the Pacific now, it would have been impossible for B-17s and B-24s to fly those distances in the Pacific.
And so the makers of the Flying Fortress begin the project in haste, starting work on a plane that is built before it is even designed.
You would always like to build a prototype airplane and fly it and work the bugs out before you commit production of the airplane. In this case, the Air Corps made it known at the very onset of the program that they were going to buy production quantities of airplanes before the prototype ever flew.
Certain sections of the aircraft are constructed before detailed designs of other parts are even sketched out. They begin a long and painful journey to build one of the greatest airplanes ever. Boeing decides that the B-29's central nervous system is to be based in America's heartland, Wichita, Kansas. A small city of just 120,000 people is chosen as the site where the Superfortress is to be built.
Why Wichita specifically? There are a couple of reasons for this. If you look at a map of the United States, you'll see that Wichita is just about in the dead center of the country. Also, unlike some other cities in the state, like Kansas City, Wichita had a very tiny proportion of foreign-born residents. Some government officials were concerned that immigrant workers would be more inclined to participate in labor agitation, might be more inclined to come from a socialist or communist tradition, or in some cases might be allied with Nazism.
Hundreds of miles away from America's vulnerable coasts, and a farming population familiar with machinery requiring less money to live on, Wichita is ideal for Boeing. Expansion is a necessity, and the city is eager to accommodate both the government and Boeing during the war years.
The Great Plains region mobilized to lobby to bring industry to their area. The state of Kansas organized an Industrial Development Commission in 1939, and in fact, the governor of Kansas went to Washington, D.C. to lobby on behalf of his state, arguing that Kansas was safe from invasion. It had lots of natural resources, such as oil, gas, and coal, and it had a large supply of pragmatic farm boys.
And so begins an assembly line of epic proportions. A similar system that Henry Ford used to make Model Ts in Detroit, Boeing is using to make Superfortresses in Wichita. Grandmothers, who never wrestled with anything more intricate than a wood stove up until 2 years ago, are building Superfortresses at Wichita. What is true at Wichita probably applies equally to other major production units of the B-29 program. The Superfortress truly can be said to be a product, as President Lincoln said, of their government. That is, of, by, and for the American people. Quoted from the New York Times. With a small army of workers, over 60% of the aircraft is fabricated on the spot. Unfortunately, one plant cannot do the job alone. The outsourcing of the B-29's many parts are done in cities such as Marietta, Georgia, Omaha, Nebraska, and the home of Boeing, Renton, Washington.
There were something like 764 airplanes on order before the B-29 ever flew. Those airplanes were going to be built by 3 companies in 4 plants. Boeing was going to build the airplane in Wichita and Seattle, the Renton plant, Bell in Omaha, and Martin in Marietta, Georgia. So production was committed before the airplane ever flew, and it was a high-risk program, recognized as a high-risk program from the very beginning.
It is a project coming from every corner of the country, a true testament of America's industrial strength during the Second World War. As the B-29 is constructed, one notices that it is not revolutionary but evolutionary. A true sign of the times, with militaries thinking bigger is truly better. At the beginning of American war production, the average aircraft weight is estimated to be just over 3,000 pounds. 4 years later, that average is shot up to over 10,000 pounds. With this plane's massive size and potential, it comes as no shock that its supporters are eager to get up in the air as soon as possible. Although the enthusiasm for the B-29 is strong, the call for a plane of this magnitude is easier said than done. Being twice the size of the B-17 and requiring double the horsepower, completing it is no easy task.
It was a big jump from, let's say, the B-17 for people who were in the 17 that went to the 29, and it was one very big jump for us who went from the B-25 to the B-29. It was monstrous.
You had tremendous power in 4 engines compared to the B-17. And I flew the B-29 up to 40,000 feet, whereas the B-17 would barely go to 30,000.
Before being put into production, 10,000 drawings are sketched of a prototype, costing the government over $3 million. with it needing to be rushed only adds to its growing list of future problems. Its main flaw is its complexity. With a need to fly at extremely high altitudes, a pressurized cabin is desired, so its crew are not required to wear masks in the air.
It was the first pressurized airplane, one that I'd ever flown. I think it was the first thing after the B-17, the B-24 that came along that had a pressurized cockpit, which made flying at altitude far more comfortable than unpressurized, of course.
You kept your oxygen mask handy just in case you lost your pressurization. But it was very comfortable. It was a big relief, much easing of strenuous activity on the part of the whole crew.
Also, with 4 extremely powerful engines and over 60,000 different pieces needed to assemble just one plane, this project is turning into one giant jigsaw puzzle.
So the airplane that got submitted had grown from an 85,000-pound airplane to something around 110 or 111,000 pounds.
In addition, an enormous amount of material needed. 27,000 pounds of aluminum, 5,000 pounds of rubber, 10 miles of wiring, over 1,000 pounds of copper and brass, and nearly 2 miles of tubing are needed to make this monster. To some, this is becoming a case of the United States biting off more than it can chew. Despite the best efforts of its designers, engineers, and workers, the B-29 is encountering numerous problems. For a population of 120,000, putting together a 120,000-pound superfortress is a massive undertaking due to its workforce's relative inexperience. Recruited from the ranches and farms of the Great Plains, these men, and now women, have not been properly trained for a task of this magnitude. What normally takes years to learn, they must master in just months. While in flight, as is the case with Lockheed's Constellation, overheating is becoming the norm.
Some of the engine problems that were there were things like overheating of the engines. Early on, we had problems, again, with propellers that would overspeed, wouldn't govern properly, wouldn't feather properly. We had problems with the carburetors. The engines would backfire.
During one test flight, a B-29 crashes, killing the entire crew, including Eddie Allen, Boeing's chief test pilot. Despite these deaths and setbacks, the project must continue. For America's top generals, the B-29 is becoming a race against the clock. With air bases being built in China, the expected arrival of the superfortresses is scheduled for April of 1944.
I understand, because of an agreement between Roosevelt and Chiang Kai-shek, that these airplanes were going to be in China a year before they were. So the rush would get them out of the country.
The crew at Boeing, however, is nowhere near completion. Despite this harsh reality, one man, General Hap Arnold, does not throw in the towel. Writing to fellow General Curtis LeMay, he proclaims, "The B-29 project is important to me because I am convinced that it is vital to the future of the Army Air Forces. More concerning are the project's economic costs. By the end of development, testing, and production, the government is estimated to have spent over $3 billion on the superfortress, a third more than what is spent on developing the atomic bomb." For these generals, it is not only militarily vital that the B-29 succeed. Financially, if the model fails, billions will be lost.
Well, when I got to Wichita, I found out they weren't flying them because the Boeing company had taken this position that the airplane was no good and they weren't going to make them. I understand, secondhand or third, that General Arnold told Boeing officials, "You're going to build that airplane or give us back $50 million we've already advanced for its being." They thought real quick. They said, "Well, we'll build the airplane, but we won't take any responsibility for it." Arnold is reported to have said, "You don't have to take it. The Army Air Corps will take that responsibility."
These ongoing problems become crystal clear in March of 1944. Hap Arnold, on an inspection mission, asks how many are ready for shipment to India. Due to the complications in its design, he is shocked when Boeing's answer is 0. It is for this reason there lies an insurance policy, a backup, a contingency plan in case Boeing fails. And for this possible savior, the American government goes to the other 3 giants of aviation, companies that designed their own version of the Superfortress. The B-30, 31, and 32 can hopefully come to the rescue if all else fails. At least, that is what the government hopes. Lockheed, with their B-30, represents only a token effort. Many are unsure if they can carry through on a project of this magnitude. The plan to make their Superfortress a gigantic bomber version of the Constellation goes nowhere. Their main priority is given to the Connie, which makes it up into the air nearly a year and a half before the B-29 does. The situation is identical at Douglas. Their B-31 design never sees the light of day. Of its 3 competitors, only one gets a plane up in the sky. Consolidated, makers of the B-24 Liberator. They, like Boeing, are commissioned to evolve their design with the B-32, known as the Dominator. Weighing 50 tons, possessing a speed of over 300 miles per hour, and containing 4 2,200 horsepower engines, the aircraft appears to be a carbon copy of the Superfortress.
The B-32 was an outgrowth of the B-24, like the B-29 was an outgrowth of the B-17.
And just like the B-29, the Dominator suffers from the same technical problems. The program is almost canceled in December of 1944 due to development being severely behind schedule. By the end of the war, only a handful of B-32s fly over the Pacific, conducting mainly reconnaissance missions.
The B-32, I had one there at Bomber Test. I flew it. It had no distinctive advantage over the B-29. Matter of fact, I had to order my test pilots to fly it. They didn't much care about flying it.
The key advantage for Boeing is its will and determination. With countless man and woman hours put into this project, combined with billions of dollars in funding, they are determined to complete it no matter what the cost. Being so far along with its development, they must see it through.
The aircraft plants in Wichita adopted suggestion systems where workers could offer suggestions for how to improve efficiency and productivity and actually get cash awards if their ideas were selected by management and then implemented. Many of the amenities that employers offered to workers, like cafeterias, in some cases child care centers, and so forth, were specifically designed to improve productivity and decrease absenteeism rates.
War production is the foundation of our war effort. And by the same token, what you do from day to day affects your country's success in this war. Never forget, you are working for him, for the youth of America, for the boy next door. On the last day of the last war, thousands of such boys were killed. If the war had ended 24 hours earlier, they would have returned. What you do tomorrow, today, in the next hour, can help to bring the last day of this war closer and to save lives that would otherwise be lost. We are all in this together. You and I, your own boy, and the boy next door. Our job is not finished. Let's finish the job together.
With a gun to their heads, the people of Kansas come together and begin rolling Superfortress after Superfortress off the assembly line.
In the essence of wartime conditions, you overcame absolutely any obstacles. It may have taken only 1/10 the time that it would take to solve a technical problem in peacetime. But under wartime conditions, you know, if you can't solve it with 10 engineers, get 100, and that's what the contractor did.
When Arnold, in a fit of rage, demands that 175 B-29s be on time for delivery, this almost impossible task is miraculously accomplished by the people at Boeing, Wichita. Working around the clock for 4 straight weeks, 600 workers meet this goal. Compared to a grand total of just 4 in August of 1943, by February of 1945, Boeing Wichita produces 100 B-29s per month. With 20,000 man-hours, these workers are able to produce 4.2 Superfortresses a day, a shining example of both their patriotism and dedication. Until the end of the war, production is right on target. On June 5, 1944, from an Indian airbase, the first B-29s take to the sky. It has been a strenuous journey, as the aircraft has traveled more than half the world to reach its target. 10 days later, under the 20th Bomber Command, headed by Hap Arnold, 47 Superfortresses depart from Chengdu, China, and begin bombing Japan mercilessly. For the next year, the B-29 becomes the primary tool of destruction in the Pacific. With the Japanese already in a weakened state, they simply cannot compete with this advanced super bomber. Things only get worse as the Americans capture the Mariana Islands. With a shorter range to Tokyo, these strategic outposts do nothing but accelerate B-29 activity over the land of the rising sun. Day after day, Japan is bombed into submission. Led by General Curtis LeMay, his strategy of bomb them and burn them is proving effective. Cities the size of New York, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh are being decimated. LeMay even remarks that by mid-1945, they are going to run out of targets to bomb. That dilemma is solved on August 6, 1945. A B-29, the Enola Gay, flies over Hiroshima, Japan, carrying an atomic bomb on board. The order to go nuclear is given by President Harry Truman. The effect of this new weapon forever changes the way wars can now be fought. The results are devastating. An estimated 80,000 people are killed from the first atomic bomb.
I had seen the city perfectly visible as a place where a lot of humans were moving about. If you could see it, you could see movement. But when I flew back by it and I was out the co-pilot's window, I look at it, all I saw was something that reminded me of a boiling pot of tar.
3 days later, another superfortress, Boxcar, drops a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, killing tens of thousands more. These 2 attacks, in addition to the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan, finally causes this once proud nation to surrender unconditionally.
Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, on Sunday, September the 2nd, 1945, the most horrible war in history came to its complete and formal end. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu signed for Japan. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander.
The B-29, with its years of development and construction, proves its worth to the American military. For it is truly the bomber that made the difference.
It's my personal opinion, and I'm sure I'll find detractors, that the B-29 won the war, World War II, in the Pacific.
Oh, I think without a doubt, when you consider particularly the Pacific War, it was a key point in winning it.
And so the people of Wichita, the people of Marietta, the people of Omaha, and the dozens of other towns and cities that contributed to its production go back to their regular lives. Boeing, with no more orders from the government, lays off 70,000 workers at the end of the war. The service they have done for their country, however, does not go unnoticed.
I think historians would argue that war production in the United States was pivotal, if not decisive, in the war effort overall. The United States, over the course of the war, spent more than $50 billion on Lend-Lease aid to the Allies. By 1944, U.S. factories were producing a ship a day and a plane every 5 minutes. But that's a phenomenal amount of production.
In the B-29's history, the men and women in these plants are just as important as Hap Arnold, Curtis LeMay, and those piloting the aircraft.
It's a joint effort of everyone. The maintenance, the supply, everyone contributed to it.
For a 3-year period, of the over 3,000 Superfortresses built, 1,600 of them come out of Wichita alone. On August 29th, in a statement to Boeing employees, General Arnold proclaims, "Thanks to what you did, our combat crews had been trained and B-29s were ready and waiting to occupy Iwo Jima, Saipan, and Okinawa as each base was prepared to receive them. You were given a job to do, and the way you finished that job met our greatest expectations. For myself, and on behalf of the Army Air Forces, I say to you, well done, and thanks from the bottom of my heart." The Superfortress should be remembered as the greatest roll of the dice in American aviation history. In an era where aircraft manufacturers had little to gain with costly military projects, it is amazing that it was able to get into the skies as quickly and efficiently as it did. The race for the Superfortress is also truly an American story. Its industrial capacity and strength, a supply line uninterrupted from bombings and destruction, and a diligent and patriotic workforce is what made the B-29 possible.
Summer 1945. The war in Europe is over. But the world is not yet at peace. In the East, Japan fights on. Her Imperial Navy is all but ruined. Her armies are destroyed or cut off on isolated islands. Her air forces are crippled by the loss of her experienced pilots. Japan's dream of empire is shattered, but her military leaders refuse to surrender. The battle for Okinawa ended in mid-June after 82 days of ferocious fighting. From there, the Allied forces of America and Britain planned to attack the home islands of Japan. But their victory on Okinawa had come at a terrible price. More than 50,000 Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen were dead, wounded, or missing. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed or committed suicide. And more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians, perhaps a third of the population, were dead, many of them by suicide. As Allied leaders prepared for a massive invasion of Japan's home islands, military leaders in Japan swore to fight to the very last man, woman, and child. In late July, United States President Harry Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a fateful decision, one that they hoped would end the war as soon as possible and save both the Allies and the Japanese from the bloodbath of an invasion. On 6 August 1945, the Americans unleashed a weapon the likes of which had never been seen before, the atomic bomb. 6 years and $2 billion in the making, the atomic bomb would, finally, bring an end to the Second World War. Perhaps no mission has ever changed the course of war more definitively or abruptly than the one undertaken by the 509th Special Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. August 1945, 8:10 a.m. local time. 32,000 feet above the city of Hiroshima, Japan, a lone American B-29 bomber made its way toward a point over the city's center. Dutch Van Kirk was the navigator of that lone B-29. Today, he is the last surviving member of her 12-man crew.
To the day Paul Tibbits died, he and I would argue about whether or not I volunteered for this job. He'd say, well, I called you, you volunteered. I'd say, yeah, when I got my damn orders, I noticed they're dated 2 days before your telephone call. So much for the volunteering part.
I was flying with the crew that, the captain in charge of that crew couldn't handle him. His name was Rocket. And nothing the matter with him, but he had two characters in his outfit he couldn't handle. One of them was Theodore J. Van Kirk, and the other was Thomas W. Farabee. And so I said, that's the crew I want. They'll do what I want them to do. Well, it worked out that way. Of course, that's the beginning of a long relationship between the two of us. We didn't fly together too much, but we knew where each other was and all that sort of thing. When I got the bomb project, of course, they're the first two people I asked for.
On that fateful morning in Hiroshima, Japanese authorities ignored that lone bomber. It was too high for fighters or anti-aircraft fire. And besides, a single enemy bomber was not much cause for concern. At precisely 8:15 and 17 seconds, Bombardier Tom Farabee released a single 5-ton object from the aircraft's bomb bay. Freed of its heavy load, the B-29 surged upward. Sergeant Wyatt Dusenberry, the flight engineer, pushed the throttles forward, and the pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbits, banked the aircraft left into a gut-wrenching turn that would take it far away from the target as quickly as possible. It was an evasive maneuver the crew had practiced many times. The object fell for 43 seconds through the clear air toward its aiming point, the T-shaped Aeoi Bridge. At 1,890 feet above the waking city of Hiroshima, the object, known to its builders as the Little Boy, erupted in an unimaginable burst of heat and light, a single weapon with the power of 13 to 18,000 tons of high-explosive TNT. In an instant, its 1,200-foot fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Near ground zero, sand melted into glass, and every living thing was vaporized or turned instantly to carbon. A full mile from the center of the blast, the shockwave turned buildings into shrapnel. In the cockpit of the Enola Gay, 9 miles from the blast, it was as if 1,000 flashbulbs had popped off all at once. In the tail, Gunner Bob Caron winced in pain and tore off the special goggles issued to the crew. Even through the polarized welding glass lenses, He feared he had been struck blind by what he later described as the fire of 1,000 suns. Of all the Enola Gay's crew, Karen had the best view of the blast. To the rest of the crew, he described a roiling, fiery mushroom-shaped cloud that boiled up 30, 40, 50,000 feet. A moment later, the first shockwave from the blast hit the airplane, shaking the huge bomber like a leaf in a gale. The aircraft was shaken a second time as the shockwave rebounded off the earth below, but the Enola Gay held together. Deke Parsons, the Enola Gay's weaponeer and bomb commander, sent a coded message to Tinian. The mission was a success. Below, the city had vanished beneath a boiling pall of dirty brown smoke. Flames were erupting everywhere. Karen likened it to bubbling molasses or the fires of hell. Colonel Tibbits turned the plane broadside to the blast to give the crew a better view. While Karen wrestled with a bulky K-20 camera, the rest of the 12-man crew was mostly silent.
The first thing we saw was a mushroom-shaped cloud, so-called mushroom-shaped cloud. All different colors within the base of that cloud. And on top of it was a mushroom you could see. It was up well above our altitude already, I'd guess, 40,000 going higher. And then as we turned on around and everything, we could see the city of Hiroshima, and we could make absolutely no visual observation because the entire city was covered with thick black smoke and everything. You want the description of it? I say it looked like a pot of boiling oil down there.
As Tibbits turned the Enola Gay toward Tinian and home, many of the men on board shared a single thought. This could be the end of the war. As they headed back to their base at Tinian, 6 hours away in the Marianas Islands, the men aboard the Enola Gay were awestruck by what they had seen. They struggled to find the words to describe it. From the tail, Karen could see the mushroom cloud for more than an hour. Finally, 400 miles from Hiroshima, he reported to the rest of the crew that the cloud was no longer visible. As the plane flew southward across the featureless Pacific Ocean, conversation dwindled among the crew as the excitement of the mission wore off.
We were also damn tired of it coming back. It didn't make any difference what mood we were in, for crying out loud.
From Tinian, Captain Parsons' radio message was forwarded to the Pentagon. President Harry Truman was aboard the USS Augusta, returning from a meeting with Britain's Winston Churchill and Russia's Joseph Stalin. During lunch with a group of enlisted men, Truman was handed a copy of the message from Tinian. "This," he exclaimed, "is the greatest thing in history."
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
Aboard the Enola Gay, the crew talked of the end of the war. Some speculated that it might be all over by the time they landed at Tinian. How could the Japanese fight on?
Everybody said they can not possibly stand up to force like this. In fact, Dick Nelson made it quite simply. He said, "This war is over."
The atomic bomb was an entirely new weapon, more complex, more sophisticated, and more deadly than any weapon system that had come before it. The airplane that delivered the atomic bomb was equally innovative, a technological marvel. At the time, it was the largest and most sophisticated aircraft ever flown. With its large bomb load and very long range, the B-29 was designed and built for just one purpose: to strike at the very heart of Imperial Japan. In 1939, with the threat of war gathering in Europe, the Army Air Corps requested design proposals for a very long-range super bomber.
Things looked so bad in Europe that it would look like Great Britain would be defeated and occupied by the Nazis. And the United States would have to bomb Europe from the United States. And so there came into being the idea of the intercontinental bomber. Now, it was ultimately realized in the B-36, but it set everybody's minds thinking.
Boeing Aircraft Company had a set of brilliant engineers.
They had done a whole series of design studies that led ultimately to the B-29. They incorporated in it so many things that would otherwise be regarded as too risky to involve into a single design to get the performance that they thought they would need. They incorporated pressurization in a bomber. They incorporated new engines, new propellers, new fire control systems, new metallurgy, new types of aluminum in it. Everything was pushed to an extreme. When it came into being, it had a very checkered career. There were constant problems with engine fires and so on. And yet, without a doubt, it was the most advanced bomber of the war. So it was the supreme bomber of World War II.
Boeing's B-17 bomber could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and had a maximum range of 2,000 miles at a top speed below 300 miles per hour. For its new super bomber, the Army Air Corps specified a bomb load of 20,000 pounds, a top speed of 400 miles per hour, and a range of over 5,000 miles. The B-29 would be the largest and most complex aircraft of the Second World War. It would extend the range of strategic bombing over distances never before seen in combat. With its pressurized compartments, automated gun controls, huge engines, and immense size and range, B-29 was, in its day, one of the most complicated pieces of movable machinery ever manufactured. And it was designed, built, tested, refined, and ready for combat in just 4 years. Building the B-29 was not a simple task. Thousands of subcontractors fed parts to the 5 main assembly plants, 2 in Washington state and 1 each in Georgia, Kansas, and Nebraska. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941 and brought the United States fully into World War II, the ex-B-29 prototypes were not yet completed. But the Army was already impressed with the design. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, the B-29 went into full production with an order for 500 aircraft. The prototypes had not yet been flown. In the first months of the war, it was clear to American military planners that no other bomber had the necessary range to strike decisively at the heart of Japan, and the Army pressured Boeing to complete the B-29s in record time. But the Air Corps requirements for the B-29 were challenging. Its design was highly advanced, and the aircraft was plagued with problems. Throughout the B-29's development, and for much of its service life, the most common source of problems was the engines. The Wright R-3350 duplex cyclo was one of the most powerful radial engines ever built. With its 18 air-cooled turbocharged cylinders in 2 rows, this mammoth produced up to 3,700 horsepower. But it had problems. The rear cylinders tended to overheat and cause engine fires. The crankcase was made of high magnesium alloy. It burned so intensely that it could burn through the main wing spar in seconds, with predictable and catastrophic results. Once it was airborne, the B-29 could fly on just 2 of its 4 engines, but the failure of a single engine during takeoff could be disastrous, with a full combat load of bombs and fuel. Other problems included uneven distribution of the air-fuel mixture to the cylinders and the engine's tendency to eat its own valves. During World War II, nearly all B-29s operated in the tropics, where high temperatures on the runway increased the risk of engine fires and reduced aircraft performance. Engineers at Boeing and Curtiss-Wright tried many fixes, but the B-29's engine problems continued until the introduction of the 28-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R-4360, which came too late for World War II. During the war, mechanics in the field scrambled to keep up with the fixes ordered by the engineers, including replacing the 5 top cylinders on each engine every 25 hours of engine time and replacing each entire engine every 75 hours. It was hardly standard practice to put an airplane into production before its prototype had been built and flown. Through 1942 and 43, as bugs in the design were discovered and fixed, many changes were applied on the production line. The B-29 is just one example of progress being accelerated by the demands of war. By the end of 1943, production was in full swing, but there were so many changes that the B-29s coming off the production line were flown straight to modification depots for extensive refits. Bad weather and other delays meant that in early 1944, Boeing had built nearly 100 B-29s, but fewer than 15 were airworthy. General Hap Arnold, commander of the Air Corps, stepped in to tighten the screws, and by mid-April, 150 B-29s were ready for deployment.
At B-17, you always put your oxygen mask on when you wore your oxygen mask continuously. If you moved around, you had to take a portable bottle with you, and it was cold, it was uncomfortable, it was noisy. I could give you a lot of things wrong with it.
Power settings had to be calculated precisely and frequently for best performance. Getting the right takeoff and landing speeds was especially critical, based on weight, air temperature, and field elevation. But all the extra charts and arithmetic paid off in more speed and longer range. The most revolutionary feature of the B-29 was its Central Fire Control System, or CFCS. Each of the 4 gun turrets mounted 2 50-caliber machine guns. Each turret could be controlled by any one of 4 analog computers, 1 in the nose and 3 in the pressurized waist compartment. The 5th gunner, in the tail, could control his own pair of 50-caliber machine guns or the guns in the rear ventral turret. The crewman in the rear dorsal turret was the central fire control gunner, who assigned the turrets to each of the other gunners. The computer-controlled gun sight for each turret compensated for the B-29's speed, the target's speed and angle, temperature, humidity, and gravity. The analog gun sight computer was highly advanced for its time and gave B-29 gunners an effective kill range of 1,000 yards, twice the range of a manually aimed gun turret. Paul Warfield Tibbits, Jr., the man who would later become a U.S. Air Force and aviation icon as the commander of the first ever atomic bomb mission, was born in Quincy, Illinois on 23 February 1915. The family moved to Iowa in 1918, where Tibbits' father worked in his family's grocery business. When young Paul was 9, his father moved the family to Miami, Florida, and with a partner, started a successful wholesale candy company. In the summer of 1927, Doug Davis, a barnstorming pilot, was under contract with the Curtiss Candy Company to fly over county fairs, horse races, and other public events and drop its new Baby Ruth candy bars from his airplane. In Miami, Davis came to see the elder Tibbits, who was the distributor for Curtiss Candies. Young Paul sat in on the meeting and was enthralled by the dashing pilot. Davis needed someone to ride along in his airplane and drop the candy. Young Paul volunteered. Reluctant at first, his father agreed.
He looked at my father and said, "Mr. Tibbits, I have to have somebody fly with me in the front seat and throw these bars out While I fly from the back seat, I'll throw them out there. And of course, I held my hand up right away. My father looked at me and he said, "No, not you." And my dad's business partner said, "Paul, let him go, for God's sake, let him go." And Doug Davis spoke up at the time. He said, "Mr. Tibbits," he said, "I'm married. I got a lovely wife and two lovely girls, daughters." And he said, "I'm going out there fly this airplane just like it should be flown. And I'm not going to hurt myself, and I'm sure not going to hurt him." And my father relented and said, "Okay." That was giving me my first ride, throwing candy bars out over Hialeah racetrack. Well, I'm fascinated by that machine. I'll tell you, there's nothing like it.
As they flew over the local racetrack just after the second race, Paul threw out handfuls of the sweets. The Baby Ruths landed on target, and as the crowd scrambled for the goodies, Davis made 2 more bomb runs over the track before heading downtown to the beach. They flew similar missions every day for a week before Davis moved on to another city. He later joined Eastern Airlines and became its most famous pilot, helping to pioneer air travel in the U.S. Young Paul Tibbits never forgot the excitement of those flights over Miami. In 1928, as young Tibbits prepared for 8th grade, his father sent him to Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, where he would spend the next 5 school years. At first, Tibbits rankled at the discipline of the academy, but eventually he chose to make the best of it. He became a good student and an average athlete. He had a few run-ins with the cadet commander over various infractions, but the fairness with which he was disciplined made a lasting impression, and it would influence his own style as a commander in World War II. In later life, he described his 5 years at the academy as distasteful, but he also believed that they were useful in preparing him for the challenges he would face as an adult. The summer before he started college, Tibbits hung around Miami's Opa-locka Airport, fueling planes and doing chores to earn money for flying lessons. He soloed that summer in a Taylor Cub after 6 hours of dual instruction. After 5 years of military school, Tibbits had trouble adjusting to the freewheeling college life, and he nearly flunked out of the University of Florida. As a pre-med student at the University of Cincinnati, he helped out in a local clinic and spent his free time flying for the fun of it. Tibbits found himself less and less enthusiastic about his chosen career in medicine, and more excited about aviation. As Tibbits pondered his future in late 1936, Douglas Aircraft Company introduced the DC-3 airliner. Suddenly, commercial air travel went from daring to safe and reliable, and Tibbits found his calling. Lacking the funds for a commercial pilot's license, he applied to be a cadet in the Army Air Corps and was inducted in February 1937.
I said, "Dad, I'm going to be leaving school." He tried to look at me, "Leaving school? What for?" "Well, I'm going down to San Antonio to become a flying cadet and learn to fly airplanes in the Army Air Corps." He said, "Well, you're over 21, I guess that's all right." But he said, "I want to remind you of something." He said, "Going back for a long time, I've supported you pretty well. I bought your clothes and done everything for you, put shoes on your feet and all that." But he said, "Now that's finished. You're on your own."
The Army, he reasoned, would teach him to fly and launch him on a career as an airline pilot. It never occurred to him that he might fly in combat. At Randolph Field in Texas, he was determined not to wash out. His 5 years at Alton had taught him all about military discipline and spit and polish. If following the rules was the key to success, he would follow them to the letter, avoiding every temptation to slack off or show off. Tibbits finished basic training at the head of his class and received the Army Air Wings in February 1938. As a top graduate, he was given his choice of assignment: pursuit, as fighters were called then, or observation. There were no bomber pilots in the Air Corps in those days. On the advice of one of the tactical officers at Randolph, he chose observation. That would open the door to solo missions and multi-engine training. During advanced training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Tibbits met a pretty department store clerk named Lucy Wingate. They were married in June 1938. After completing his advanced multi-engine training, Tibbits stayed at Fort Benning, flying the Martin B-10 bomber, mostly towing gunnery targets. In early 1940, the Air Corps' 3rd Attack Group received the new Douglas A-20 Havoc. To fly the high-performance attack bomber, the Army searched for pilots with 1,000 hours or more of multi-engine time. Tibbits' name was on that list. He was transferred to the group's base at Hunter Field near Savannah and assigned as engineering officer for the 90th Attack Squadron. In 1940, the focus was on Europe, not Japan and the Pacific. In occupied Europe, the Germans were building flak towers up to 100 feet high and mounting anti-aircraft guns on top of them. Pilots in the 3rd Attack Group learned to fly their A-20 Havocs at high speed in tight formations, at 100 feet or less above the ground. That would allow them to fly below the German flak towers, hugging terrain to avoid enemy gunners and plane spotters. Tibbits enjoyed the challenge. It required steady nerves and precise flying skills. By 1941, it was becoming clear to many Americans that the war was coming. The U.S. was organizing its civil defense system for warning of air attacks. Tibbits' 90th Squadron was charged with putting the new system to the test. Their simulated low-level attacks on cities like Boston and New York showed that the system was woefully inadequate. Theoretically, Tibbits later wrote, he and his squadron destroyed most of the East Coast. Attacking coastal cities, roaring in on the wave tops in tight formation at 200 miles per hour, the A-20s would sometimes nudge each other, a wingtip denting a fuselage or propeller nibbling at an elevator. But there were no serious accidents, and the pilots of the 90th Squadron became experts at low-level tactics. Tibbits was on a return flight to the squadron's base at Savannah when he heard the news that the Japanese had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Tibbits was selected for training in the new B-17 bomber, and the B-17s were slow in coming. He was temporarily assigned to form an anti-submarine patrol unit flying Douglas B-18 bombers. As American war production geared up, the big flying fortresses began to arrive, along with the crews that would fly them. The B-17 was the largest land plane of its day, and some people thought it was too big and too complex for regular Army Air Corps crews to handle. Tibbits was given command of the 40th Squadron of the 97th Heavy Bomb Group at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida. It was his task to prepare his green B-17 air crews for combat. It was an exhausting job. Tibbits sometimes flew 18 hours a day checking out the new pilots. There was little time and few resources to turn the raw airmen into effective combat crews.
Now, the training was nothing. You just flew the airplane around. You'd take barrels out in the Gulf of Mexico and drop them into water, and they'd fly around and shoot at them. That was our training. We had no gunnery training or anything. Most of the time, we didn't have ammunition to train. When we got to England, we were the blind leading the blind. Believe me, we were.
Too soon, Tibbits' squadron was ordered to the West Coast, bound for the Pacific.
We got orders to go to Fresno, California. Now, the group commander was not with me, but he got on the telephone. He called me. He said, Paul, you're going to get orders to go to Fresno, California. I am in Pennsylvania here at Olmsted with the other two squadrons, which I knew. He said, I will get the message. I will send one message to you about where to go, and I will join you later. I got my message. We got in the airplanes and we started for Fresno, California.
During their few weeks in Fresno, California, Tibbits drilled his men constantly in formation flying, navigation, and other critical skills. But when their orders came, the 97th Bomb Group was sent back across the country to Bangor, Maine. In early June, they were finally ordered to England. On 17 August 1942, Tibbits led 18 B-17s on the first daylight raid by American bombers on German-occupied Europe. Their target was the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen, France. Prior to that raid, British and American bombers had been striking German-occupied targets only at night. The Germans at Rouen were not expecting a daylight raid. Tibbits and his bombers caught them by surprise that day. About half the squadron's bombs hit their targets at Rouen. Their accuracy was less than was hoped for, but it was still much better than nighttime raids were achieving. 2 of Tibbits' bombers were damaged by flak. Their Spitfire escorts drove off 3 German fighters. All the bombers returned safely to England. The only injuries were caused by a pigeon that smashed through the nose of one plane, pelting the bombardier and navigator with shards of plexiglass. In October, Tibbits led B-17s and B-24s to Lille, France. It was the first time more than 100 bombers were joined in a single raid. Dutch Van Kirk would become Tibbits' navigator, entered the Army Air Corps cadet program in October 1941, and earned his navigator's wings 6 months later at Kelly Field in Texas.
After about a week there, maybe 2 weeks, they called out a bunch of names of 30 people, and they got us together and they said, "You people are going through here in half the normal time." Well, they forgot to and doubled up on the calisthenics as well as the classes and everything else. They almost killed us, for heaven's sakes. So we finally convinced them they only needed the regular calisthenics, but we went through in double time, and we almost all went to the 97th Bomb Group. Look at that. My first combat mission, we didn't get any enemy action. So I come back and I thought, oh, this is a snap. No touching to it. And I think it was maybe the 3rd or 4th mission that I changed my mind. I've been looking out the window on the right-hand side. We had 2 guns up there, one out the right, one out the left, and a 30 caliber out the nose. And we never hit a damn thing, but that's okay. I was looking out the window on the right-hand side. I turned around and looked back a little bit, look out the window on the left-hand side. By the time I turned around and looked back out the window on the right-hand side, there were 4 bullet holes where my head had been. And I decided, they're shooting at me. I earned my money today. So from that on, we knew we were in a war.
That October, Tibbits, now a lieutenant colonel, was given the job of flying General Mark Clark from England to Algeria to meet with French commanders prior to Operation Torch, the American invasion of North Africa. Tibbits stayed in North Africa flying bombing missions when it moved to Algiers. In January of 1943, he became Chief of Bomber Operations for General Jimmy Doolittle, who commanded the 12th Air Force in Africa. Less than a month later, General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, asked Doolittle to send back to the States his best field grade officer with the most experience in B-17s. The Air Forces had a problem, and Paul Tibbits was just the man to fix it. Arriving in Washington in late February 1943, Tibbits learned that the Army Air Force's newest bomber, the B-29, was in serious trouble. The aircraft was plagued with problems, mostly related to the newly developed Wright R-3350 engines. In July, Tibbits was sent to New Mexico to test the B-29 bomber's combat characteristics, with P-47 fighters making simulated attacks. The big bomber was hard to control in the thin air at high altitudes. It would be impossible to fly in tight combat box formations. Tibbits began to doubt the airplane's ability to survive in combat. On a day when his regular test plane was out of service, he borrowed a stripped-down B-29. Without its 7,000 pounds of guns and ammunition, the plane flew higher and faster and was much easier to control. Above 30,000 feet, the lightened B-29 could turn tighter than a P-47 and could outrun the fighters. It was an important lesson that he would later put to good use. In September 1944, Tibbits was called to Colorado Springs to organize and train a bomber group for a super-secret mission, one that might end the war. The Manhattan Project, America's program to develop an atomic bomb, was far enough along that figuring out how to deliver the weapon and training the crews to do it had become an urgent concern. The Army Air Force did not want a suicide mission. Tibbits' job was to figure out how to deliver the bomb safely and to assemble a bomb group specially trained to drop the weapon. He was to prepare 2 special bomber squadrons, one for Japan and one for Germany. Tibbits would get whatever men and resources he needed. If anyone refused, the code word "silver plate" would breach all barriers. As his base, Tibbits chose Wendover Field in Utah. The facilities were adequate and very isolated. USO comedian Bob Hope called it Leftover Field. The men called it the end of nowhere. As the core of his 509th Composite Group, Tibbits chose the 393rd Bomber Squadron, a combat-ready B-29 unit, and he began bringing in the best crewmen from his B-17 days. Bombardier Tom Farabee, navigator Dutch Van Kirk, flight engineer Wyatt Dusenberry, and tail gunner Bob Karen. These men formed Tibbits' own B-29 crew and helped to train the other crews.
It really came home to me when you saw, when they were describing what you were going to do, that you were going to do something that would destroy an entire city. It could be you're going to shorten the war or end the war. And you saw a bunch of guys running around who you knew were nuclear physicists. How many people in the organization knew enough about atomic energy at that time to guess that we were working on an atomic bomb as beyond me?
Security was extremely tight. Only Tibbits knew the unit's true purpose, and the men were cautioned. Don't talk to anyone, and don't even be curious.
You didn't talk about it, because if you did, you would get sent off the illusions. There's no place like that.
How does one drop an atomic bomb and get away safely?
The scientists came to us and right at the beginning, and one of them said, "We think you will be okay if you're 9 miles away when the bomb explodes." I can remember looking at the guy and saying, "What the hell do you mean you think?" We could be wrong. Some guys are saying it could be 50 miles away. Some people are saying you can't get far enough away.
The bomb would be released from 6 miles high. A steep turn of 155 degrees and a shallow dive for speed would put the plane about 9 miles away from the explosion.
Immediately we decided we wanted to use stripped-down B-29s. These were B-29s that had all the turrets taken out, all the guns taken out except the tail guns, as much of the weight as we could get out of that B-29, take it out and get rid of it, so it could get up higher and go faster. We could not have done this mission in a regular B-29.
With stripped-down B-29s, the crews dropped dummy bombs and practiced navigation and the evasion maneuver that Tibbits had worked out. Germany surrendered on 8 May 1945. The 509th Composite Group now had only one target: Japan. They were ready, but at Los Alamos, the scientists argued about the odds. A 1 in 10,000 chance that the bomb's trigger would fail. They wanted 1 in a million. Tibbits said he would take 10,000 to 1 any day and he gave the order to move the bombers to Tinian, 1,500 miles from Japan. The pieces were in place for a mission that might end the war.
Most people have no concept of why we dropped the bombs at the time we did. They just assume that we dropped the bombs in order to cause those large casualties. They do not take time to read it and understand it. And no matter what you tell them, I don't think most people will never understand it. You go to high schools today, and the high schools today don't understand anything about World War II. I think I did describe how I was introduced at one's high school as a veteran of World War XI.
There had been no other mission like it in history. The use of an atomic bomb for strategic purposes in time of war. The complexity and destructive power of the weapon is well documented. That the little boy dropped on Hiroshima and the fat man dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later caused the Japanese leadership to change its policy of defending the home islands to the last man, woman, and child to one of immediate surrender is a matter of historical fact. It is a singular story of technological genius and the fog of war, magnificent courage and terrible suffering, diligent planning and unpredictable happenstance. The mission of the B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay and its crew on August 6, 1945, not only changed the Second World War, it changed the face of warfare as we know it until this day. It was, in fact, a mission that changed human history. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions that Changed the War. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the airplane that dropped the atomic bomb, was as much a technological marvel as the bomb itself. It featured innovations like a pressurized cabin, an electronic fire control system, and remote-controlled gun turrets. Its wingspan, 141 feet, was nearly twice the span of Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress. At 155,000 pounds combat weight, the B-29 was one of the largest aircraft to serve in World War II. It went from drawing board to combat in less than 4 years. It went into full production before its prototype flew, and the first B-29s to come off the assembly line were full of problems. But eventually, it became a very capable strategic bomber, and it served the U.S. Air Force through the end of the 1950s. In late 1944, the United States was well on the way to developing an atomic bomb. the U.S. Army Air Forces created a special B-29 bomber group to deliver the bomb. The 509th Composite Group. Its leader was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbits, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced B-17 pilots and a test pilot for the B-29 program. Tibbits was tasked with organizing and training 2 special bomb units, one for Germany and one for Japan. As the core of his 509th Composite Group, he chose the 393rd Bomber Squadron, a combat-ready unit of 15 B-29s. In an archival interview, Paul Tibbits talked about the mission.
You got a tremendous amount of responsibility there. You got a tremendous amount of authority. Be careful of how you use it. We're in General Ent's office, and he is instructing me as to my assignment. You are going to organize and train a unit to drop these atomic bombs simultaneously in both Europe and Japan. And he told me about using my code word of silver plate, but he said General Arnold had advised his entire staff in Washington that any requisition with the word silver plate would be honored without question. I reflected back over the things that had been said, knowing that it was going to be the most important thing that I ever did in my life.
He added 3 more factory-fresh B-29s to the group, personally selecting his own aircraft from Boeing's production line. One of his main concerns was how to drop an atomic bomb and get away safely. The bomb would be dropped from 30,000 feet and it would explode 43 seconds later. Tibbits worked out an evasive maneuver that would get his bomber 9 miles from the blast.
The scientists came to us and right at the beginning, and one of them said, "We think you will be okay if you're 9 miles away when the bomb explodes." I can remember looking at the guy and saying, "What the hell do you mean you think?" We could be wrong. Some guys are saying it could be 50 miles away. Some people are saying you can't get far enough away. So you just paid your money, you took your choice.
The 509th trained at an isolated airfield at Wendover, Utah. Their mission was super secret. Only Tibbits and a handful of officers knew what they were training for, though others may have guessed.
We had every telephone coming into Wendover, Utah, or going out, it was tapped. Security was the most important thing that we had to maintain because they didn't want anything to get out.
Tibbits cautioned the men of the 509th not to talk to anyone about the unit and not to speculate about its purpose. Violators quickly found themselves transferred to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, where they could talk as much as they liked to the walruses and seagulls. The air crews practiced navigation and dropped practice bombs called pumpkins that were shaped like the bulbous atomic bomb but filled with conventional high explosives. For maximum altitude and speed, they stripped their B-29s, dumping 7,000 pounds of gun turrets, ammunition, and other gear. Their only remaining armaments were their tail guns. By April 1945, it was clear that the war in Europe was in its final days. The bombers of the 509th now had just one target: Japan. In early May, they began shipping out to Tinian, an island in the Marianas group, 1,200 miles from the Japanese homeland. Tinian is a 39-square-mile coral island, roughly 5 by 13 miles, in the northern Marianas island chain, 3,700 miles from Hawaii. Claimed by Japan after World War I, it was mainly a sugar plantation under Japanese rule. During World War II, the Japanese built 2 small airfields and launched fighters and light bombers from the island. U.S. Marines invaded the island in July 1944 and secured it on August 1st. 8,000 Japanese soldiers died in the 9-day battle. The Marines lost 328 dead and 1,500 wounded. Several hundred Japanese soldiers remained hidden in Tinian's semi-tropical jungles. The last survivor was captured in 1953. With Tinian secured, 15,000 Seabees moved in to build runways and prepare camps for 50,000 personnel. They built 2 airfields for the B-29s, a total of 6 8,500-foot runways, said to be the longest runways in the world at the time. Tinian became the busiest military airfield in the war. Massed bombing raids from Tinian began in November 1944. On the night of 10 March 1945, 279 B-29s, flying below 6,000 feet, dropped 1,700 tons of bombs on Japan's capital city, Tokyo. The bombs ignited a firestorm that destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed at least 100,000 Japanese. 14 B-29s were lost. These massed raids continued until the end of the war. On Tinian, the 509th was again shrouded in secrecy. While other B-29 units flew low-level airstrikes on Japan, from which some crews did not return, the planes of the 509th flew milk runs, dropping their pumpkin-shaped bombs from high altitude far out of reach of enemy fighters and flak. Other units began to view Tibbits' crews as pampered misfits who contributed nothing to the war effort. When word slipped out that the group's mission might end the fighting, someone wrote a satirical song called "The 509th is Winning the War." In truth, the group's station on Tinian was not hardship duty. The hours were long, and the work was hard, but there were white coral beaches and a hospital full of pretty nurses to provide recreation. In mid-July, the 509th began flying missions to Japan, dropping their pumpkin bombs on military and industrial targets. In contrast to the huge low-level raids, the 509th sent only 2 or 3 bombers at a time over Japan, and bombed in daylight from high altitude, around 30,000 feet. The Japanese began to ignore these daytime attacks. After all, 2 or 3 bombs did little damage compared to the massive nighttime raids. On 17 July, Tibbits received a coded message from General Groves, head of the Manhattan Project. The atom bomb test had been successful. Scientists had set off the world's first atomic explosion at Alamogordo, New Mexico. Up to then, it had all been theories and high hopes. Now, the super weapon was a reality. From Tinian, Colonel Tibbits made 3 round trips to Washington between May and July to work out problems and to discuss target selection for the atom bomb. At first, the list of possible targets included the cities of Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. All of these cities were important industrial or military centers, and all had been spared from conventional bombing. Kyoto was taken off the list, and Secretary of State Henry Stinson pointed out that it had great historic and religious significance to the Japanese.
Remember, up to this time, they had a target committee, and there were a lot of people picking out targets and everything else. These targets, which had never before been bombed by any other means. I knew the 5 of them beforehand, but I didn't know which one it would be. But we were all in favor of Hiroshima. That was where we could do the most good with 1 bomb that we were going to drop and everything else. That's because the Second Army was there. You probably don't realize it, but 25% of the people killed in Hiroshima were military people. And then you had materiel that was going over to Shikoku for the defense of Japan and everything else. You could probably do more good at bombing that than you could have any other city.
The 509th continued to fly practice missions to Japan, dropping their black powder bombs configured in shapes similar to the anticipated atomic bomb. In mid-July, Tibbits learned that the atomic mission might be given to a different B-29 unit. Colonel Butch Blanchard, the senior operations officer on Tinian, had argued that other B-29 crews were more experienced and more qualified. Tibbits countered that the 509th had been training specifically for the atomic bomb mission and were fully competent to fly it. He offered to take Blanchard on a practice mission to prove his point. With Blanchard in the jump seat, Tibbits flew to nearby Rota Island, still held by the Japanese. The Tibbits plane arrived at its target precisely on time and dropped its simulated atom bomb precisely on target. With the bomb away, Tibbits snapped the big bomber into the evasive maneuver his crews had practiced. Blanchard turned pale as the G-forces pinned him to his seat. He declared that he'd seen enough. The 509th would drop the atom bomb.
Well, B-29 was not supposed to hold together under that maneuver, we later found out. Make the turn when you're coming off is steep enough so your tail starts to stall. Then you know you have the turn steep enough. And just push the throttles forward, lose a couple thousand feet in the turn, and just run like hell.
In the second half of July, the 509th made a dozen conventional raids on Japanese cities, dropping the simulated atom bombs, bulbous, pumpkin-shaped casings filled with black powder or other conventional explosives. The raids avoided cities that were on the atom bomb target list. Their strange tactics, just 2 or 3 bombers at high altitude, confused the Japanese. Fighters almost never tried to intercept the bombers, and anti-aircraft fire couldn't reach the B-29s at 30,000 feet. Gradually, the Japanese became accustomed to seeing small groups of bombers that didn't cause much damage. Although some of the pumpkin-shaped bombs were aimed by radar onto cloud-covered targets, it was decided that the atomic bomb would only be dropped if the target were clearly visible to the bombardier. Colonel Tibbits was prohibited from flying these practice missions to Japan. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded all B-29 combat operations against Japan, declared that Tibbits was too valuable to the atom bomb mission and knew too much to risk falling into Japanese hands. The pumpkin raids proved to Tibbits that his crews were ready for the atom bomb mission. They could deliver the bomb precisely on time and precisely on target. The practice bombing missions also revealed a potentially serious problem in the bomb's design. The fuse that ignited the bombs was a radar-actuated proximity fuse that was supposed to detonate the bomb at 1,890 feet above the ground. But on 2 occasions, the fuse detonated its pumpkin bomb too soon. Once over Wendover and once over the Pacific, the bombs detonated just after leaving the bomb bay at 31,000 feet. The premature explosions did no damage to the planes, but they caused some serious worry among the crews. Tibbits made the last trip to Washington in mid-July. There, it was decided that everything would be ready by the first week of August. Tibbits flew back to Tinian to oversee the final preparations for the mission. On the morning of 26 July, the cruiser USS Indianapolis arrived at Tinian to deliver the firing mechanism and a small slug of uranium for the atomic bomb. The second slug of uranium was delivered by a B-29 from the United States. Halfway between Guam and the Leyte Gulf, in the early hours of July 30, the Indianapolis was hit by 2 Japanese torpedoes. Of the nearly 900 men who went into the water on July 30, only 317 were rescued. It was the worst sea disaster in the history of the U.S. Navy. Back on Tinian, the technicians continued to prepare what some were calling the device. Its final assembly would be done on the day before the mission.
We never called it an atomic bomb at all. How many people in the organization knew enough about atomic energy at that time to guess that we were working on an atomic bomb is beyond me. But if you guessed it, you didn't talk about it. Because if you did, you would get sent off the illusions or some place like that.
Fat Man, like the atomic bomb tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico in mid-July, was an implosion-type plutonium bomb. A sphere of shaped explosive charges surrounded a smaller sphere of radioactive plutonium. When the explosive charges detonated, the pressure of the explosion compressed the plutonium sphere to critical mass, setting off an uncontrolled atomic reaction. Fat Man would be the second atomic bomb used in combat. The bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima was of a different type than the one tested in New Mexico. This was a rifle-type bomb in which one slug of uranium would be fired into another. The pressure of their impact would push both slugs of uranium to critical mass and trigger the explosion. Little Boy was a simpler design, and the scientists considered it more reliable than the implosion-type Fat Man. But in fact, a rifle-type atomic bomb like Little Boy had never been tested. Its first use as a weapon would also be its first trial run. America, China, and Britain sent the so-called Potsdam Proclamation to Japan on 26 July. Surrender, it said, or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese ignored it. Three days later, General Carl Toohey Spatz arrived on Tinian to take command of the U.S. strategic forces in the Pacific. He brought with him a signed order from General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project. The order authorized the 509th Composite Group to, quote, deliver its first special bomb as soon as weather will permit visual bombing after about 3 August 1945, unquote. The target was to be one of 4 cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, or Nagasaki. Paul Tibbits favored Hiroshima. In a handwritten note on the margin of the order, President Truman wrote, quote, release when ready, but not sooner than August 2, unquote. Truman was meeting in Potsdam, Germany with Allied leaders Churchill and Stalin in early August and did not want the bomb dropped until that meeting was over.
I was never challenged. Nobody ever asked me, can I drop the bomb? Or, have you made a decision who's going to drop it? If they had, I'd have told them yes. Decision was made the first day I heard about it, and that's going to be me.
Colonel Paul Tibbits would fly the first atomic bomb mission with a hand-picked crew. Captain Bob Lewis, age 25, from Richfield Park, New Jersey, would be Tibbits' co-pilot. Lewis had often commanded the aircraft when Tibbits was busy with other duties. Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, navigator, age 24, from Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and Major Tom Farabee, bombardier, age 24, from Mocksville, North Carolina. Both men had been part of Tibbits' regular B-17 flight crew in England.
Tom Farabee was the best poker player I ever saw in the Army. And that's saying a lot. Best crap shooter, too. We met in the nose of a B-17. We were best friends until he died.
Captain William Deke Parsons, age 44, from Chicago, was a U.S. Navy ordnance expert who had worked on the Manhattan Project. He would be responsible for arming and monitoring the atomic bomb during the flight to Japan. He was assisted by Lieutenant Morris R. Jepson, 23, of Logan, Utah. Tech Sergeant Wyatt Dusenberry was the Enola Gay's flight engineer. He had flown in B-17s with Tibbits.
Dusenberry could really get more out of engines than anybody else. He was a master at engines and that sort of thing. Best flight engineer I ever saw.
Lieutenant Jacob Besser, 24, of Baltimore, Maryland, was a radar specialist.
These bombs operated on radar proximity fuses. They had to very accurately measure the height above the ground to get their explosion. If the Japanese had gotten onto the frequency on which they had operated, they could have exploded the bombs in the airplane. But we didn't think that was a very good idea. So we took Jake along, and Jake was our radar countermeasures expert.
Filling out the Enola Gay's 12-man crew were PFC Robert Chamard, assistant flight engineer, Sergeant Joe Staborik, radar operator, PFC Richard Nelson, radio operator, and Tech Sergeant Bob Karen, tail gunner. During the first few days of August, Tibbits gave considerable thought to a name for his airplane. He had no doubt that the first atomic bomber would become a celebrity of sorts, and the current identifier, plane number 82, didn't sound very heroic. He finally decided to name the plane after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbits. She was a strong, caring woman who had much influence on Tibbits' life and values. Bombardier Tom Farabee and navigator Dutch Van Kirk both knew Tibbits' mother and both heartily agreed with his choice. On the 3rd of August, the final order came from General Curtis LeMay, who commanded all B-29 operations in the Pacific. The official order for Special Bombing Mission Number 13 listed Hiroshima as the primary target, followed by Kokura and Nagasaki. If the number 13 worried any of the crew, they never mentioned it. Over the next few days, Tibbits and Farabee pored over huge aerial photographs of the three targets, especially Hiroshima. Farabee chose a landmark east of the city as his initial point where he would begin his bomb run. For the aiming point, he chose a bridge in the center of Hiroshima. Of the many bridges across the Ota River, the T-shaped Aioi Bridge would be the easiest to spot from 31,000 feet above the city. With orders to drop the atomic bomb only if the target were visible, Tibbits wanted to be sure of the weather over each city. Not content to rely on long-distance weather forecasts, he decided to send 3 B-29s ahead as weather reconnaissance planes. The planes would leave Tinian about an hour before the Enola Gay. They would fly over the primary target and the two alternates and report on weather conditions. 3 other B-29s would leave Tinian with the Enola Gay. One carried scientific instruments to measure the intensity of the atomic explosion. Another carried cameras to photograph the mission and the blast. The third B-29 was a backup plane. It would follow the Enola Gay to Iwo Jima, about halfway to Japan. There, it would land and wait. If the Enola Gay had mechanical problems on the way to Japan, Tibbits would return to Iwo Jima, transfer his crew and the atomic bomb to the backup B-29, and complete the mission. On the morning of the 5th of August, 1945, the forecasters said the weather looked good for a mission the next day. Final preparations went into high gear. The Enola Gay was moved to a loading pit while the bomber crew attended a mission briefing. By noon, the atomic bomb was loaded in the B-29's specially modified bomb bay.
And then they told us to go get some sleep. How they expected to tell you you're going to go out and drop the first atomic bomb, which might blow up the airplane, and go get some sleep is absolutely beyond me. I know Tibbits didn't sleep, I knew Farabee didn't sleep, because we were all three in the same poker game. And I don't even know who won. It was that bad.
The crews of the 3 strike planes were summoned again about 11 p.m.
They came and got us, final briefing, latest weather information, all that sort of stuff, air sea rescue, everything of that type. And then over to the final breakfast. And I remember vividly what we had for the final breakfast. Paul Tibbits loved pineapple fritters. I hated the damn things. We had pineapple fritters for breakfast that evening, I should say.
The Japanese were known to be torturing B-29 crewmen who had been shot down over Japan. As Tibbits left the mess hall, the flight surgeon handed him a small pillbox containing 12 cyanide capsules. Tibbits gave one of the capsules to Parsons, but kept the rest to be handed out only in an emergency. Paul Tibbits made it clear to the crew that if the plane were shot down, each man should decide on his own whether or not to commit suicide to avoid capture. The crew arrived at the flight line about 1:45 a.m. to find the Enola Gay bathed in floodlights. General Groves wanted the plane's departure from Tinian to be recorded on film.
We got in trucks, went down to the airplane, and I think when we all got down there, we were all surprised because the plane was lit up by keg lights, it was like a Hollywood premiere, for heaven's sakes. Dick Nelson, who comes from Southern California, said, looks more like a supermarket opening to me. Point I want to make, if all the interviewing is being done, all the pictures are being taken and everything of that type, were being done by the Manhattan Project. There was no media on the island at all.
The crew boarded the aircraft and went carefully through their checklists. No one wanted to make the mistake that would jeopardize the mission.
We were very heavily loaded on takeoff. We were about 250,000 max gross weight. Normal max gross weight of a B-29 over there. At that particular time, it was about 235,000.
At 2:45 a.m., Tibbits began his takeoff roll on Tinian's 8,000-foot runway. As the aircraft reached 140 knots, its normal takeoff speed, co-pilot Bob Lewis reached for the control yoke.
I was confident that this was the only way to do it so that I could control with the tail if I had to. So when I'm going down there and I kept it past that magic 140 that you were used to, he started to grab the yoke and pull back on it. He's lift it off. And I told him, I said, keep your goddamn hands off of that yoke. I'm flying this airplane.
And he was in charge, absolutely. No. That was Paul Tibbits on an airplane. I don't know what speed we coming off on it, but I know we used every damn foot of that runway.
At 2-minute intervals, the camera plane and instrument plane took off behind Tibbits, followed by the backup B-29. Conventional bombs were usually armed on the ground, but if the Enola Gay were to crash on takeoff, Parsons worried that a fire could set off the atomic bomb's black powder trigger. As the Enola Gay reached its initial cruising altitude of 4,700 feet, Deke Parsons and Lieutenant Jepson climbed into the bomb bay to arm the atomic bomb. While Jepson held a flashlight, Parsons inserted a small slug of uranium and a small explosive charge that would fire one uranium slug into another and trigger the atomic explosion.
I was worried to beat hell. The fact that we had an atom bomb right behind me, didn't concern me a whole lot. The fact that Deke Parsons was back there in the bomb bay, fooling the black powder, that worried me, because I knew what black powder would do.
With the arming task completed, the crew relaxed. Many of them slept, making up for the sleepless days leading up to the mission. The 6-hour flight to Japan seemed routine and uncomplicated in spite of their unique payload.
Use celestial navigation to get up to Iwo Jima, and if you get lost between Iwo Jima and Japan, you are the lousiest navigator in the world. I'm sure there's some people who have done it already, but not many. Because you had a volcanic island sticking up above the ocean. and you could pick them up on radar and it'd lead your way right in.
At 5:55 a.m. Tinian time, the crew sighted Iwo Jima, halfway to the target. The backup airplane, a B-29 named Top Secret, landed there. Tibbits circled the island once to allow the two other B-29s, Great Artiste and an unnamed number 91, to form up on Enola Gay, and the three planes headed for Japan, 3 hours away. At about 7:45 a.m. Tinian time, the Enola Gay climbed to 32,700 feet, her intended bombing altitude. Half an hour later, Tibbits received a coded message sent from Major Etherly, the pilot of Straight Flush, one of the B-29 weather reconnaissance planes. The weather over Hiroshima was suitable for a visual bomb strike. The other two weather planes also sent messages. The skies over Nagasaki were clear, but Kokura was hidden under ground fog. The skies over all three cities were empty of other Allied aircraft. Orders kept them well clear of the possible targets. About 9 a.m. Tinian time, the city of Hiroshima came into view, its white buildings gleaming in the morning sun. Dutch Van Kirk's navigation was near perfect, and the Enola Gay reached the initial point almost precisely on time. Tibbits turned the plane left to a heading of 263 degrees to begin the 3-minute bomb run.
We made the turn to the west. We wanted a bomb on a heading of 270. I missed it. We got on a heading of 263, and we just went in and dropped the bomb. Bomb run was very long. We were having conversations while we were on a bomb run. And Tom Farabee turned around to me once and he said, "Christ, Dutch, if we'd have sat on a bomb run this long over Europe, we wouldn't be here." Well, I said, "Is it still on the target?" He says, "It's gone right down the track." He says, "Nothing I can do." You see, when the bombardier is making his bomb run, he's flying the airplane. It's on automatic pilot, everything of that type. And Tom was extremely good at it.
An hour earlier, the B-29 weather plane, Straight Flush, had set off air raid sirens in Hiroshima, but no fighters rose to attack it.
The Japanese had no defense against high-flying airplanes up until that time, and we were going to be as high as we could get. So we didn't expect any enemy action of any type on this particular mission, and we didn't get any.
10 miles out, Bombardier Tom Farabee spotted his aiming point, the T-shaped AEOE bridge. At 90 seconds from bomb release, Tibbits switched the autopilot and gave the plane to Farabee. The city of Hiroshima was one of Japan's principal seaports. It was an important shipping point for soldiers and equipment. It was also one of the landing points for the Allied amphibious invasion that was planned for November 1945. It was the headquarters of the Imperial Second Army, the Chigoku Regional Army, and the Imperial Army Marines. There were large military supply depots and many small factories for military goods in this city of 420,000 people. The Enola Gay's pneumatic bomb bay doors opened automatically at 9:15 and 17 seconds Tinian time. The atomic bomb tumbled away. Its burden gone, the Enola Gay pitched sharply upward. Tibbits now had to fly the world's largest bomber as if it were a nimble fighter plane.
We made a right-hand turn, 60-degree bank, lost about 2,000 feet in the turn, pushed the throttles forward, just ran like hell.
Tail gunner Bob Karen felt like the last man in a wild game of crack the whip. Dutch Van Kirk recalls one particular thought as the plane sped away from the release site.
I hope it works. Because, it had never been dropped before. 2 days before, the fusing mechanism didn't work. I think if I'd have been a betting man, I would have bet before we dropped that bomber it was going to be a dud. So everybody was waiting to see whether it did explode and did it work. And then suddenly we saw the bright flash in the airplane. Hallelujah, it had worked. After we were certain we weren't going to get any more shock waves, we turned around to look what had happened. The first thing we saw was a mushroom-shaped cloud, all different colors within the base of that cloud. And on top of it was a mushroom you could see. It was up well above our altitude already, I'd guess, 40,000 going higher. And then as we turned on around and everything, we could see the city of Hiroshima, and we could make absolutely no visual observation because the entire city was covered with thick black smoke and everything. You want the description of it? I say it looked like a pot of boiling oil down there.
The initial fireball incinerated or vaporized everything in the immediate area of the blast. Beyond that, buildings were flattened, then set on fire. 4 square miles of the central city were destroyed, about 60% of the city's area. The firestorm that erupted after the blast widened the destruction. Estimates put the human toll at 60 to 80,000 dead, and an equal number injured. In Tokyo, many in the civilian government argued for surrender. The Russians were poised to attack Manchuria. The Allied blockade was strangling Japan. There were food shortages. Victory was no longer possible. But Japan's military leaders vowed to continue the war. America, some said, had no more atomic bombs. On 9 August, a B-29 called Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The mission was flawed. The bomb missed its target by nearly half a mile, causing less destruction than at Hiroshima. That same day, the Russians invaded Manchuria. 2 days later, a group of Japanese military commanders met in a plot to seize the government and continue the war. The plot failed when senior officers refused to join the coup d'etat. On 14 August, more than 1,000 American Army and Navy bombers hit Japanese cities. Faced with the total destruction of his nation, the emperor ordered the unconditional surrender of Japan. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the nature of warfare forever. Atomic weapons elevated the role of the strategic bomber and helped give birth to the U.S. Air Force as a separate service. They shaped much of the military and political landscape of the second half of the 20th century. The decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, made jointly by Truman and Churchill, has remained controversial. But one fact cannot be disputed. The use of the bombs was intended first and foremost to end as quickly as possible a terrible war against a ruthless enemy who was determined never to surrender.
Let me say emphatically that there's no way in those days that I could have even considered not wanting to do it. I was anxious to do it. I wanted to do everything that I could to subdue Japan. And in other words, I wanted to kill the bastards. That was the attitude of the United States in those years.
The Battle of Okinawa in early 1945 produced 50,000 Allied casualties and up to 150,000 Japanese casualties. If Japan fought on, Allied leaders feared a score or more of Okinawas to be fought all over Asia.
If you were over there around Tinian, Saipan, Guam at that particular time, you knew that an invasion was going to have a lot of casualties because they were building hospitals all over those islands. We wanted a war to be over. We wanted to stop the killing.
The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was instrumental in ending the Second World War. Tibbits, his crew, more than 1 million American servicemen and women, and the American public were overwhelmingly grateful for the peace that followed. And the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has helped to ensure that such weapons have never again been used in anger.
I'd just like to say to all people that before you say anything critical about what we did and the casualties we caused, or anything of that type. Study the history of the war, study the history of that people, find out what was really going on back in those days, and then make up your mind.
The generation of Americans which fought and won World War II was made up of the children of the Great Depression. As they reached high school and university age, they didn't imagine they would be further called on to meet the greatest challenge our liberty, indeed our national existence, has ever faced. During the years the United States was engaged in the war, 1941 to 1945, 16 million of them, more than 10% of the entire population of the country at that time, wore the uniform of the armed forces. Very few, if any, American families were untouched by the most devastating conflict in human history. The challenge was met. Then our young men and women returned home to foster a season of prosperity, progress, and peace, unmatched in history. 16 million came together in a common cause, but their individual journeys were unique. With each voice that goes silent, we lose another report, another singular interpretation of the events of World War II. According to U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs statistics, only 558,000 of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II were alive in 2017. Richard Donaldson, who flew 35 missions as pilot of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, is one of them.
My name is Richard Donaldson. I was born on March 6, 1923. And I go to the Veterans Administration for my medical needs now, and know in that place, you're almost known by your date of birth. And I frequently kind of mumble over the original date by saying 1823 just to check and see if the nurses are listening. Graduated from high school in 1941 and had matriculated at Carleton College and was there when Pearl Harbor occurred. Part of my duties there and working out my tuition was waiting on tables in the girls' dormitory. It was on a Sunday, and we had eaten our meal after we'd finished serving the girls and walked out of the basement dining area, and a girl on the fourth floor hollered out and from that point on, all of us knew that we were prime targets to be in the military because we were just the right age. I did not go into the military until the middle of my sophomore year, but I had talked to a cousin of mine who was a good friend of mine about what we would do in our military service, and we both agreed that we wanted to fly because at least most Air Force pilots could come back and have clean sheets in the bed that they slept in at night instead of sleeping in a muddy trench like the soldiers did in World War I. We had agreed we both wanted to go right away into the service, and we found out that at the age of 19, which we both were, we had to have our parents' consent in order to go into the service right immediately. And he got his parents to sign off, and I couldn't get mine. They didn't want me to go any sooner than I'd have to. He was called in January of 1943, and I was put in the Air Corps Reserve, which would have deferred me until my college class graduated in 1945. Well, in February of 43, they decided to call all the Air Force Reserve all over the country into the service. So I was called in February. So not having my parents' permission amounted to only about 5 or 6 weeks that I was delayed in going into the service. And I was inducted into the service down at Jefferson Barracks right out of St. Louis.
At Jefferson Barracks, Dick Donaldson entered the service in the oldest operating U.S. military installation west of the Mississippi River. It was built in 1826 and is used as a base for the Army and the Air National Guard to this day. Richard was not the first member of his family to go there.
And it turned out that was the same place my dad had been inducted in World War I. And I had a great-grandfather that was stationed right outside of Jefferson Barracks in the Civil War. But it was a horrible place to be. It was hot in the summer and cold in the winter. And this was in the spring, early spring of February of 43. And they put us in huts were 16-foot square. There were 8 of us in each hut, and no insulation, no lining, and it was almost 0 temperatures. And we had one stove in the middle, and they put a 5-gallon pail of water right next to it. And on normal mornings, that would be frozen solid. We all got colds, and we all wanted to get out of St. Louis, I remember.
But Richard Donaldson and his fellow recruits weren't going to be leaving St. Louis just yet. Like so many American institutions, colleges all across the country were incorporated into the war effort in those days. And one of them was Washington University in St. Louis.
And we all wanted to come back up in the upper Midwest where we'd been from to go to college. But instead of that, they loaded us on a truck that took us into Washington University in St. Louis. So I ended up with another 5 months in St. Louis that I wasn't looking forward to. We went to school there and at the university, and we had professors that were very good. We took mathematics from how to count from 1 to 10 up through spherical trig and all kinds of college classes.
Richard's class next would go to Santa Ana Army Air Base in Costa Mesa, California. It was an anomaly, a 1,300-acre air base with no hangars, planes, or runways. The first buildings were completed in May of 1942. It became a huge base for receiving air cadets from civilian life and giving them basic ground training prior to attending one of the contract primary aviation schools for flight training.
But anyway, we got out to Santa Ana, and there were 700 of us in the class. And there were, I think, 60,000 on the base. From the Santa Ana base, where we were determined, we took tests to see whether we should become a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier. And everybody, of course, wanted to stay in the pilot training.
These men are aviation cadets. In the near future, they will have learned many things. How to pilot a plane, how to navigate, or how to operate a bomb site. These are the fighting men of the United States Army Air Force.
Among the country's great accomplishments during World War II was the building and training of the greatest Air Force in the world. From the Air Corps of 1939, with 20,000 men and 2,400 planes, to the Army Air Forces of 1944, with almost 2.4 million personnel and 80,000 aircraft, it was a nearly miraculous expansion. One of the key components of the program was the primary training of thousands of enlisted pilots through civilian contract schools. One such contract school was operated by the Palo Alto, California School of Aviation at the King City Airport. It was the next stop for Richard Donaldson.
And King City had been a private flight training base. So when we got there, all of our instructors were civilians. And where we normally got paid $75 a month, which was the base pay for a cadet at that time, they gave us $275 at the head of a pay line, and we walked down and paid off for our room and our board and so forth, and ended up with $75. With the civilian instructors, it was so much easier than it would be with the military, which we found out when they moved us to basic training in Chico, California. Then we were back in the Army again.
At the 1,045-acre Chico, California airport, which the City Council leased to the War Department for $1 a year, cadets encountered the infamous BT-13, the Vultee vibrator.
When we got to basic, we flew that BT-13, which you also have up there. The Vultee vibrator, we called it. When you got into as you were approaching a stall and got just ready to stall out, it started to vibrate. And it would very easily fall into a spin. And it was very difficult to get out of a spin once they got in one. So more than one cadet over the years spun right into the ground, not being able to get it out of there. But fortunately, I didn't have that problem. Also in basic training is where we first did any night flying. And that just scared the dickens out of us. It was scary enough flying an airplane that you weren't familiar with, but then to fly it at night was doubly so.
In the months preceding World War II, the U.S. Army entered into the first of many lease agreements with the city of Stockton to construct and operate an Army training facility and airfield at Stockton Municipal Airport. It became known as the home of the Army Air Corps Advanced Flying School.
From then on, we went to advanced training down at Stockton, California. And that was with a twin-engine airplane. It was a Cessna 17. We called it the double-breasted Cub or the bamboo bomber, or all kinds of names. I remember I had wanted to fly a twin-engine airplane, but I wanted a P-38, which was a fighter airplane, where you'd fly alone and much more maneuverable and so forth. The brass answered that by saying we are no longer in a defensive war. We're now in an offensive war, so we don't need fighter pilots anymore. We want very heavy bomber pilots. So we were relegated to flying bombers at that point. So when we graduated from advanced, I was assigned to go to B-24 training school at Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I think we were there for 9 weeks, long enough to learn how to spell Albuquerque anyway.
The Consolidated B-24 Liberator was an American heavy bomber designed by Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego. With nearly 19,000 built, over 8,000 by Ford Motor Company, it holds records as the world's most produced bomber, multi-engine aircraft, and American military aircraft in history. The Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan famously built one of the bombers every hour.
So anyway, after finishing B-24 school, this was what they called a B-24 first pilot school. By then, under normal conditions, you would they'd assign a crew to you and you go overseas. But in my case, they were looking for pilots for B-29 training, so I was picked to go to that, and I fought the Battle of Kansas, which is where we were training at Great Bend, Kansas.
The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was another huge technological advancement brought about by the war effort. It was the single most expensive weapons project undertaken by the United States in World War II, exceeding the cost of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, by between $1 and $1.7 billion. The B-29 was the first airplane designed and built after the war began. Its innovations were jaw-dropping. Though it was huge, with a wingspan of over 141 feet, a length of 99 feet, and a height of nearly 3 stories, it was the first plane to be completely pressurized. Its 11-man crew was able to fly in comfort at altitudes above 30,000 feet, without the bulky flying suits and individual oxygen tanks previously required. An analog computer-controlled system directed 4 remote machine gun turrets that could be operated by a single gunner and a fire control officer. A manned tail gun installation was semi-remote.
And they had an awful time shooting down a B-29 because we had this remote gunnery system. Because of the fact we were pressurized, we couldn't have guns projecting through a window like a B-17 or a B-24. So they had remote firing aiming systems remote from the actual guns. And we had twin 50 caliber guns on 4 different stations, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom, plus tail gunner had his own guns. There were sighting stations on either side of the waist and on top of the waist, and also up in the nose from the bombardier.
With 4 2,200 horsepower radial engines, the B-29 could fly more than 350 miles per hour for over 4,000 miles. Its speed and its 31,000-foot operating ceiling were its best defense. Japanese fighters could barely attain that altitude, and if they did, it could not match the speed. The Superfortress could deliver 20,000 pounds of bombs.
We went to Fremont, Nebraska, where they issued all of our overseas clothing and guns and so forth. And then we flew from there to Sacramento and stayed overnight and flew then to Hawaii. And that's when, on the flight to Hawaii, we opened our orders to find out where we were going and found out it was to Guam.
The island of Guam was a symbol of the ebb and flow of the Pacific theater of World War II. A United States possession since its capture from Spain in 1898, it was captured by the Japanese in December of 1941, just 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. In a horrendous battle to retake the island in July and August of 1944, 1,777 Americans were killed and 5,798 were wounded. 18,337 Japanese were killed. And when the battle ended, the U.S. and its allies had the B-29 bomber base they sought in order to launch strikes against the Japanese home islands. The 19th Bombardment Group was activated at Great Bend Army Airfield in Kansas on April 4, 1944. It was ordered to Guam on the 16th of January 1945. On Guam, the 19th was assigned to the 314th Bomber Wing of the 20th Air Force's 21st Bomber Command.
Anyway, when we got to Guam, I think that was on the 17th of February, and we flew our first mission on the 25th. And that happened to be a daylight mission, and the idea was to fly formation all the way up to the Japanese coast and back, or at least all the way up and over the target. And we found out right away that the weather always changes. There's always at least one front between Guam and Japan, and that's where the two air masses meet, and you get a lot of bad weather, rain. And we were flying formation and at relatively low altitude, I think about 2,000 feet or so, and we ran into that first front, and right away you couldn't see the airplane on either side of it. So we had to fly in the blind all the rest of the way up to Japan and finally climb up to our bombing altitude, which was happened to be 28,000 feet. Where we broke out between two cloud masses. And we'd always heard that the Japanese were not nearly as good with anti-aircraft as the Germans were. And the first burst of anti-aircraft fire that I saw was right square in front of our nose. And the next one was one off either wing and one off the tail. And I thought, well, these guys are pretty good. But fortunately, they never fired the next one because they didn't hit us anyway. We dropped our bombs by radar. That was really a kind of a mess. There were airplanes all over the place. And we discovered the jet stream. I think no one had ever heard of the jet stream before that. And that's a very strong current of air that comes off the Asian mainland. And they clocked it up to as high as 225 miles an hour. And we found out that if we were going downwind with that, we were going so fast that we couldn't crank in the bomb sight in order to bomb. And if we were going upwind, we almost were standing still. So it was a big factor in the fact that we had to end up bombing from much lower altitudes than we were originally intended to bomb from. So we had a general in charge of us that had been in the 8th Air Force out of England and had witnessed the English bombing incendiaries at night. So he decided that our best bet was to use incendiary bombs and bomb from lower altitudes, which would be all the way from 5,000 to about 10,000 feet. We were appalled by the idea of doing that because we felt we were well within the range of any gun that the Japanese would have had, maybe even their shotguns at that altitude. and well within the range of their fighters and so forth. On the 9th of March, we flew our first incendiary raid against Tokyo, and I think there were 330 B-29s on that particular raid. And we each dropped 40 500-pound incendiary bombs. These bombs were composed of 28 sticks. They were about 3 feet long and had a detonator on either end, and it was filled with napalm. When you dropped the 500-pound cluster, that was set to explode at about 2,000 feet. And then from that, the individual sticks spread out. And whenever they hit, they would hit one end or the other, and that would explode that stick. And that napalm, which is a jellied gas, would fly any place and stick to whatever. And it burned at such a high temperature, it would melt almost any steel structure or machinery or anything. So, and of course, the Japanese buildings were almost all built out of wood. So it was very effective against them. We knew that, I think in that first raid, we bombed out about 16 square miles of the city of Tokyo. And the estimate was it was about 100,000 civilians were killed. We were very concerned about that, not as much as I am now, I guess, because we were full of the desire to beat and kill Japanese people. But we were aware of the fact that we were a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, which stipulated that you should not target civilians. And here we were targeting civilians. And we found out later, that almost everybody did that.
World War II brought the first widespread use of strategic bombing against cities and their civilian populations. During the lead-up to the war, in 1937, the Japanese were among the first to do it. Its Imperial Air Force conducted widespread civilian bombing during its attempt to subjugate China.
I know I have feelings almost every day about the fact that did much damage to 67 cities in Japan during the time that I was there, and killed more civilians than all the military losses Japan suffered in the entire war. The B-29s had also dropped, mines in the harbors to where they couldn't supply themselves with shipping even. So they were almost starving to death. And we found out later many of the Japanese military wanted to prevail and continue the war, feeling that if they made the landings which we felt would be necessary, if they made those difficult enough, they could get a better settlement, and the terms of their peace would be much better. As I don't think they could have gotten much better than their terms were. But anyway, that was a big problem in Japan, trying to decide what to do, because I think they knew that they were defeated. Okay, this is a picture of our airplane and the entire crew. This is Hans Gammel, Harry Peter Neil Gammel III.
Dick Donaldson went on to fly 35 missions to Japan in the B-29. He seems as connected to his airplane and the crew he flew with, he's the last surviving crew member, as he was the day he left Guam.
I flew my 35th mission on the 1st of August, and on the 6th of August they dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and I was on my way home at that point. I was en route between Guam and Inuitak, I think it was, on flying ATC.
Dick started home from the theater as he had arrived, by air. He and his navigator were first flown to Hawaii by the Air Transport Command.
And we finally got, the navigator and I got back to Hawaii on the way home. And there they took us off the Air Transport Command because they wanted to save the ATC planes to fly prisoners of war that would be released when they knew that the signing of the peace treaty was imminent, and they wanted to be able to get those people and fly them back as quickly as they could. So we were left there without any way to get back to the States. And there was a troop ship coming all the way from the Philippines. They didn't want to stop long enough in Hawaii to put on stores, but we did. We were able to get aboard. And because of the fact that they didn't take on more supplies, we had to go on a rationing of 2 meals a day. Anyway, finally, I think it took us, we flew overseas from Sacramento to Hawaii in 10 hours. And it took us 12 days to get back by ship. And the skipper of the ship didn't believe, he was worried that there would be Japanese submarines around that didn't know about the peace treaty yet, so he zigzagged all the way back, and that's what took us so long.
After 12 days, the ship got back to harbor in San Francisco just after 10 p.m. when the harbor had closed. The ship had to be inspected, and the inspector was not willing to come out until morning. Since the troops had already cleaned the ship, the captain would not let them go below decks for the night.
And at 7 o'clock in the morning, we were the first troop ship back after the end of the war, and they had a tugboat come out from shore with a whole bunch of girls and a band on welcome home, you know. Here we'd been standing on the deck of that ship all night long, you know. We weren't too happy about being welcomed home in that way, but anyway, it was quite an experience. And that was the end of the war for me.
In some ways, it's fair to ask if the war ever ends for the ones who have to fight it. Carl Melantes, who was awarded the Navy Cross for Valor, wrote, "When the peace treaty is signed, the war isn't over for veterans or the family. It's just starting." Certainly, there are the memories.
We were assigned to go down to Cuba for a week's overwater navigation training over the Gulf of Mexico. And we were short of B-29, so we were assigned the B-17 to fly down there. Anyway, we were flying out over the Gulf of Mexico at night, and we got an engine fire on our number 4 engine. And we did just about everything we could to put out that fire. Anyway, we were just getting ready to bail out over the Gulf at night when the fire burned the bolts that mounted it on the wing, and it fell off into the ocean or into the Gulf of Mexico. So we just flew the airplane back and landed under normal conditions. We were very fortunate there. And one night we took off. There had been thunderstorms in the area that night. Right after we left the ground, we were kind of in the clouds. And the first thing I noticed was our bombardier, which sat right in front of us, said, "What the?" And all of a sudden, our landing lights were retracting, and we hit some trees. And it was right at the edge of the cliff. And so we went over the cliff, and we had I think we bent up about 4 feet of the right wingtip, and we had every prop had at least one blade that had coral nicks in it. So here we were off that cliff and in the dark, and we had 500 feet and we'd be in the ocean, and we were in a turn to the right because of that bent right wingtip. So right away I had to toggle the bomb switch, or a switch that released the bombs into the ocean, and that gave us enough lift to where we came back and missed the cliff on the way back. And we landed at another field because there were airplanes still taking off from ours. They ended up, I had to sign a statement of charges for the airplane commander, and I had to sign for a $600,000 airplane.
There are the memories, and there are the feelings.
Well, as I mentioned before, I was very concerned about the targeting of civilians. But anyway, I find that, everything that has happened in warfare since World War II civilians are almost the only target. So I don't think, it's something that's out of our control now. Okay, after I was discharged, I went back and finished my college education. I met a girl there that I married, came back here and started in the lumber business. My grandfather and my great-grandfather had started the coal business in Tracy in 1894. And my dad had bought out my great-grandfather, I think in 1936. Some of the experiences I'd had in various places, I originally intended to graduate from Carleton College with an econ degree and go to Harvard and get a master's in business administration and take on New York City. But I had decided that the life in the bigger cities didn't appeal to me as much as a smaller town. So I had written my dad that I was thinking of coming back to Tracy, and that since we had that lumberyard physically, the plant there, I might start a lumber business to go along with the coal business, because that was kind of phasing out anyway. So that's what we did. During the time that we were starting that and running it, I raised 3 children and sent them all to college and graduate school. And then at the age of 60, my oldest son came back and was going to take over the family business. So I was casting around for something to do, and my wife and I decided to join the Peace Corps. And we spent 4 years, 2 years in Jamaica and 2 years in Barbados. I learned that the best way for happiness is to feel that you're helping people. And when you're in the Peace Corps and working with people that are having problems in third world countries, you think you're helping them. Whether you actually are or not, I guess doesn't really make any difference as long as you think so. So to me, it was a very satisfying experience. It was a life-altering type of experience. Certainly, wars don't solve anything. They're terrible things. I think anybody that's ever been involved in a war would decry anybody else getting involved in one. Killing is a messy thing. It's certainly not exhilarating, or it's nothing to pursue.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Superfortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.